He ruled an empire that feared his name. He sat on a throne built from the bones of every king who came before him, and still, he felt nothing. Power without purpose. Authority without meaning. Every noble in that gilded hall believed they knew Veilor Dreadmore. They were wrong, because the night a servant girl corrected the most dangerous alpha alive in his own sacred tongue, everything he thought he understood about strength, loyalty, and what it meant to truly rule began to burn. Stay until the end. You will not see this coming. Hit that like, and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're watching this story unfold. The candles in the great hall of Ironfang Palace stood 40 hands tall, carved from black beeswax and threaded with silver wick, and they burned with the kind of slow, indifferent permanence that reminded every man and woman beneath them exactly how small they were. 400 of them lined the vaulted ceiling in iron chandeliers forged during the first consolidation, and their light fell across the Moon Covenant banquet like something between ceremony and warning. Veilor Dreadmore sat at the head of the obsidian table and watched his court with eyes the color of a storm that hadn't decided what it wanted to destroy yet. He was 34 years old. He had been king for 11 years. In those 11 years, he had put down 6 uprisings, dissolved 2 rival alpha councils, personally executed 1 border lord who'd mistaken negotiation for weakness, and rebuilt the imperial treasury from near ruin into something that made foreign dignitaries go quiet when they heard the numbers. His shoulders filled the high-backed throne chair the way iron fills a mold, completely, without apology, without any remaining space for doubt. He was also, at this precise moment, profoundly and dangerously bored. Not the boredom of a man with nothing to do. The boredom of a man who has done everything available to him and found it insufficient. Lord Cassian Dravault was speaking. He had been speaking for 9 minutes about grain tariffs along the eastern corridor, and Veilor had stopped listening somewhere around minute 3. Across the table, Lady Mornveth was nodding with the precision of someone who had practiced nodding in a mirror. To his right, Crown Lady Seraphine Veilhart sat in pale gold silk, her posture immaculate, her smile installed like a fixture. She was beautiful in the way that certain weapons were beautiful, elegantly designed, meticulously maintained, and intended to cause harm. Veilor reached for his wine without looking at it. The goblet was empty. He set it back down. Behind him, silent and peripheral in the way that servants were trained to be, a young woman in gray household livery moved forward from the wall to refill it. He didn't look at her. He rarely looked at servants. Not from cruelty, or not entirely from cruelty, but because looking at them required acknowledging that the machinery of his palace was held together by people he had never learned to see. He was aware of this. He didn't particularly enjoy being aware of it. The wine poured. The servant stepped back. Dravault was still talking. Something about a merchant dispute in the northern grain barons and whether the imperial tariff code needed revision. Veilor's jaw tightened by a degree that nobody in the room would dare mention. Then Seraphine leaned toward him with the practiced intimacy of a woman staking territory. The Ashcroft text would resolve this question in a moment, she murmured, her voice low enough to suggest confidence, but not low enough to prevent the nearest lords from hearing. If anyone still possessed them, such a pity those archives are lost. There was a particular skill to what Seraphine did, the art of reminding a room of something painful while wearing the expression of a woman who simply finds conversation stimulating. She had been doing it for 3 years. Veilor had been watching her do it. He found it exhausting in a way he could not yet fully name. The Ashcroft codification, he said, loudly enough to cut Dravault's speech off at the knees, predates the current tariff structure by 2 reigns. It is not relevant. Seraphine accepted the correction with a smile that meant absolutely nothing. Dravault blinked, recovered. Of course, Your Radiance. The point being, Veilor said, that you've been making the same argument for 9 minutes and have not yet told me what you actually want. The table went quiet. It went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something with teeth has just moved. Dravault straightened, pressed his lips together. An adjustment to the Eastern Corridor rate. A reduction of 6% across the grain classification. 3%, Veilor said. Submit the formal proposal to my chancellor by the new moon. If the numbers hold, it passes. Dravalt sat. The table released its held breath. Valor's goblet was full again. He didn't remember hearing it refilled. He reached for it, and in doing so, knocked it. Not violently. A short, sharp impact of knuckle against silver, and the goblet tilted and spilled a red dark arc of wine across the white tablecloth. It spread with the unhurried indifference of liquid that has found a direction and intends to keep going. He heard the small, sharp intake of breath from the woman behind him before he heard or saw anything else. A cloth materialized. Gray wool, pressing into the stain. The servant had moved fast, faster than the protocol called for, because the protocol called for waiting until acknowledged, not acting before addressed. She was on the table already, both hands flat against the cloth, pressing down in short, firm strokes that actually worked against the spread rather than smearing it. Valor turned his head. She was perhaps 22. She had brown hair pulled back in the severe knot required by palace servant code, and she had the kind of face that wouldn't register as remarkable in a crowd, except that something about the set of her jaw suggested a person who had, at some point, made a decision about who they were going to be and had not reversed it since. Her eyes were focused entirely on the cloth. Her hands were steady. She was doing it wrong. No, she was doing it right, which was the problem. Palace staff were trained in the precise formal method of clearing a noble's table accident. Blot first, present the cloth for inspection, remove, replace the linen in a sequence that required 3 people and an announcement. What this woman was doing was simply fixing it, efficiently, in the way that a person who understood what needed to happen just went ahead and made it happen. Nobody in the room had commented. Nobody in the room had laughed. Valor looked at the tablecloth, looked at her hands, looked at her face. "You're doing it wrong," he said. It came out in the sacred alpha tongue, the old form, the court high language, the linguistic register that had not been used in casual address for 2 generations because it required not just vocabulary, but a structural understanding of the 17 grammatical honorifics embedded in every sentence. It was the language of royal edicts, of ancient compact texts, of alpha blood oaths sworn before the founding of the empire itself. He said it without thinking about it. He said it the way men say things to servants they don't expect to have answered. She looked up, and she answered him. Not in servant common tongue, not in the standard court vernacular, not even in the elevated noble dialect that a well-educated attendant might have been taught. She answered him in the sacred alpha tongue, precisely, grammatically, without a single structural error, with the correct honorific inversion for address to a reigning alpha, which was a construction so specific and so rarely used that Valor himself had seen scholars get it wrong at the Imperial Academy. "With respect, Your Radiance," she said, in the old tongue, flat and clear, "the standard method disperses the stain across a wider surface area before the first backing cloth is applied. This approach contains it. The tablecloth will recover. The standard method would not have saved it." The hall of 400 candles went perfectly, completely, devastatingly silent. Valor heard Seraphine's breath stop. He heard Lord Malric Thornwick, seated at the far end of the table, set down his fork. He heard nothing else because there was nothing else to hear, because 400 nobles and their attendants and their advisors and their secretaries and their bodyguards had just watched a servant in gray livery correct the Alpha King of the Iron Fang Empire in the language of ancient royal blood oaths, and every single one of them was holding whatever expression they had been wearing when it happened, because they did not yet know what the king was going to do, and they were not interested in being caught wearing the wrong face when he did it. Valor looked at her. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She was still pressing both hands into the tablecloth, perfectly steady, and she met his eyes with the expression of someone who had said an accurate thing and saw no reason to be ashamed of it. He should have been furious. He was aware of this. He knew the calculation. Fury, dismissal, a cutting phrase in the old tongue that would reduce her to dust in front of the court and reestablish the proper order of what kinds of people were permitted to speak and in what register and to whom. Seraphine was already composing her expression into the shape that said she expected exactly that response and was prepared to enjoy it. Instead, what Valor felt was something he had not felt since he was 19 years old, and learning the limits of everything he'd been taught. He felt curious, genuinely, uncomfortably, against every protocol that governed his entire life, curious. He picked up his recovered goblet. "The tablecloth is saved," he said, in the old tongue, giving her the correct response honorific without thinking about it. "Thank you." He turned back to his court. He did not look at Seraphine, but he heard her exhale. Later, 3 hours later, after the banquet concluded and the nobles filed back to their chambers with their political injuries and their whispered theories, Violor sat alone in his private council room at the far end of the East Wing, in a chair that wasn't comfortable and wasn't meant to be, with a glass of cold water and the particular quality of silence that only exists when everyone who normally surrounds a king has finally left. He was thinking about the servant. He was careful about this in his own mind. Not in the way that a man thinks about a woman who has attracted him in a simple or obvious sense. Not yet. What occupied him was the structural impossibility of what had just happened. The sacred Alpha tongue was not a language you picked up. It was not a language someone taught you because they were generous or because you were clever. It lived in 37 primary texts, none of which were available outside the Imperial Restricted Vault, the Academy of Lords, and the personal libraries of the 12 original founding bloodlines. A servant in gray household livery had no access to those texts. A servant in gray household livery had no reason to know those texts. But this woman, and he was not entirely certain she was a servant in any sense that was real, rather than performed, had answered him without hesitation, without accent, without even the slight structural wobble that a person produces when they're translating their thoughts, rather than simply thinking. She had answered him the way a person answers in their mother tongue. He reached over his desk and pulled a sheet of paper toward him. He wrote 2 lines on it, folded it, and pressed his seal. Then he sat there with it in his hand and thought about what he was doing. What he was doing was having a servant investigated. He had done this before, when security concerns arose, when allegiances were unclear, when someone in the palace infrastructure presented a complication. It was not unusual. It was, in fact, entirely normal practice. What was less normal was the feeling that settled in his chest when he thought about it. Not suspicion, not the clean, functional alertness of a threat assessment. Something less comfortable, something that felt annoyingly like anticipation. He set the sealed note on his desk. He told himself he would send it in the morning. He told himself this was a security matter. He was lying to himself, and he was experienced enough at examining his own motives to know it. And he sat with that knowledge for a while in the uncomfortable chair, in the cold silence, and then he pushed the sealed note aside and went to bed and did not sleep particularly well. He found out her name the following morning without sending the note. It came through his head Steward Aldrich Fenmore, who managed the household staff roster the way a general manages a battlefield, with total situational awareness and a deep personal investment in nothing going wrong on his watch. Valor had asked, with studied casualness over his morning briefing, whether there had been any incident reports from the banquet service. Fenmore had reported 2, a broken decanter in the East Preparation Corridor, and 1 household attendant who had directly addressed the king during a table service. "Name," Valor said. "Celine Ashcroft, your radiance. Seconded from the lower household staff 3 months ago. Prior to that, worked in the palace archive cataloging section for approximately a year. No formal complaints on record. Last night's incident will be noted in her personnel file pending your instruction on appropriate correction." Valor was quiet for long enough that Fenmore shifted his weight by a fraction. "No correction," Valor said. Fenmore blinked. "Once. Your radiance." "Was the tablecloth saved?" Yes, your radiance. The linen was recovered without permanent damage. Then the outcome was correct. Note it as a procedural variation. No correction." Fenmore's expression did not change. "As you wish. One other thing." Valor turned a page of the briefing report without looking up. "Ashcroft. Is that a common household surname?" Fenmore said nothing for a moment. "It was, your radiance. Prior to the Ashcroft treason proceedings, the name appeared in several minor provincial registrations. After the proceedings, the family line was formally struck from the noble registry. The surname has been uncommon since." Valor turned another page. "That will be all, Aldrich. Ashcroft." He spent the rest of the morning reading about the Ashcroft treason proceedings, the way a man reads about a wound that has been closed for years and needs to understand how the scar formed. The official court records were 3 volumes, dense with testimony and counter-testimony, and the formal conclusion. Lord Edron Ashcroft, head of an ancient minor noble house, had conspired to assassinate the previous king, Vaelor's father Aldrich the Elder, by providing military intelligence to a border rebellion funded by foreign coin. The Ashcroft holdings, lands, titles, trade rights, and considerable liquid assets, had been seized by the crown and redistributed. The primary beneficiary of that redistribution, by royal decree of the Old Court, had been Lord Malrec Thornwick. Lord Edron Ashcroft had been executed. His wife had died 2 months later. The official record listed a winter illness. One daughter, unnamed in the record, referred to only as the minor female issue of the condemned, had been placed in the custody of the state. The record did not specify what had happened to her after that. Vaelor set the volume down on his desk. He sat with this information for a while. He was not yet drawing conclusions. He was too experienced with the way investigations could be led by assumption to allow himself conclusions before he had more than a coincidence of names. But he was also, he recognized, no longer thinking about this purely as a security matter. Something in him, the part that had watched the court for 11 years and learned that most of the things presented to him as truth were architectures built to protect somebody else's interests, had tilted. He sent the sealed note, not the original one. He wrote a new one, more specific, addressed to Vorn Kasich, who worked for nobody that any noble in the empire would ever be able to prove, and who had been the best private investigator Vaelor had ever encountered, because he understood that the most important information in any system was always the information that the system had decided didn't exist. He instructed Kasich to find every piece of documentation related to the Ashcroft household in the decade before the proceedings. Not the court records, the other records, the ones that only existed in places where official narrative hadn't bothered to reach. He sealed it and sent it. And then he had 3 councils and a foreign trade hearing and did not allow himself to think about Celine Ashcroft until the following evening, when he was walking the private corridor above the east courtyard and looked down through the high-arched window and saw her in the garden below. She wasn't gardening, she was reading. This would not have been remarkable, except that the text she held open, large and bound in a dark cover that he recognized from 30 feet above and through glass, was a volume from the restricted academic collection, the 3rd volume of the Iron Fang Historical Compact, which dealt specifically with the original Alpha Covenant agreements of the founding era, and which was not, by any policy he had authorized, supposed to be available to household staff. She was reading it the way you read something you've read before, not carefully working through unfamiliar material, moving through it with the quick, returning confidence of a person revisiting something they already know and checking their memory against the page. Vaelor stood at the window for a moment. Then he went downstairs. He came through the garden door in the informal walkway. No announcement, no guard formation. The 2 men assigned to his person at a distance that gave him the fiction of solitude, and crossed the stone path to the bench where she sat. She heard him coming. The garden wasn't large. She looked up before he reached her, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, less than a breath, he saw something in her face that was not fear and not surprise, and not the performed blankness of a servant who has been startled. What it was something closer to a decision being made, a recalculation. The look of a person who had been planning for several possible futures and had just received information about which one was arriving. Then it was gone, and she stood, and her face was the correct neutral expression of a junior household attendant addressing a king. "Your Radiance," she said, in court vernacular. He looked at the book in her hand. "Where did you get that?" he said. She said nothing for 2 seconds, the 2 seconds of a person choosing something. "The archive corridor," she said. "It was misfiled in the general catalog, Your Radiance. I identified it and have been reviewing it to ensure it is returned to the correct restricted section." He looked at her. She looked back. He said, in the sacred Alpha tongue, in the 3rd honorific register that indicated direct and serious inquiry between parties of acknowledged standing, "How long have you been able to read that language?" The smallest pause. less than a heartbeat. She answered in the same register without error, "Since I was 6 years old." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the upper courtyard, 2 of his guards were having a low conversation. A bird on the east wall was doing something complicated with a piece of bark. "That is not a language taught to 6-year-olds," he said. "No," she said. "It is not." "Who taught you?" She held his gaze. "My father. Your radiance." He stood there in the cooling evening air of his garden, with a woman who should not exist in the position she occupied, holding a restricted imperial text, speaking a language that her background had no mechanism for producing. And he was aware, clearly uncomfortably aware, that he was standing at the edge of something that was either a very significant threat or a very significant injustice, and that both of those things required him to pay extremely careful attention. "Your name," he said in the old tongue. "Celine," she said. He waited. She was quiet for 3 full seconds, then, barely audible, in a register so low it was almost below formal speech. "Celine Ashcroft." He had already known. He had known when Fenmore said the name that morning. He had known before he sent the note to Cassock, before he came down the stairs, possibly before he walked past this window and looked down. But hearing her say it in the old tongue, the name of a house that the Empire had decided to erase, hit him differently than the paper version had. He looked at the book in her hand, the Iron Fang Historical Compact, the founding texts, the documents that laid out in the original Alpha Covenant language exactly what had been agreed and by whom and on what terms at the birth of the Empire. "Why that book?" he said. She met his eyes. "Because what's in it contradicts the official record of the Ashcroft proceedings, and I needed to confirm I wasn't misremembering." The garden went very still. Valor looked at this woman, this person who was either a remarkably sophisticated spy or the surviving remnant of a destroyed family who had spent years in his own palace waiting for something he could not yet name. And he felt, beneath the weight of everything political and careful and dangerous about this moment, one clear and inconvenient thing. He believed her, not completely, not without reservation, not in a way that would survive contact with a contradictory fact if one appeared, but in his gut, in the mechanism that had kept him alive through 11 years of a throne that attracted people who wanted him dead. He believed that she was telling him the truth as she understood it. He took the book from her hands. She let it go without resistance. He looked at the cover, looked at the page she had been reading. A section he knew, the original compact signatures, the founding bloodline seals. "Tell me what you found," he said. She was very still. The decision-making quality in her face was back. The look of someone calculating not whether to tell him, but how to tell him in a way that would not simply result in her removal from the palace before she could do anything with what she knew. She said, "The witness testimony in my father's proceedings names 3 border faction contacts. 2 of them appear in the founding compact records as deceased before the reign of your father's predecessor. The dates are incompatible. A man cannot conspire with witnesses who were dead before he was charged." The silence in the garden expanded. Valor said nothing. She said, "I've been in the archive section for 14 months. I've been looking for this since I arrived." He looked at her. "How did you get into the palace?" "I applied for a cataloging position. I am a very good cataloger." A pause. "I was educated to be one, among other things." "Among other things," he repeated. "My father believed his daughter should be equipped to survive anything." Her voice was level. "He appears to have been right." Valor closed the book. He stood in the garden with the evening settling around the palace walls and the city murmuring below and the weight of a possible injustice that, if she was right, had been sitting in his empire for years beneath a layer of official record, feeding one of his most powerful lords. He said, "If the dates are incompatible, there will be a way to verify it independently." "Yes," she said. "That verification, if it supports your account, would implicate Thornwick." "Yes," she said again. "And others." Malrek Thornwick was a man Valor had never liked with a clarity he'd never been able to formally act on. He was powerful, politically entrenched, connected to half the border nobility, and had a gift for positioning himself on the correct side of every conflict before anyone had fully decided which side that was. He had attended this very banquet 2 nights ago. He had sat at the far end of the obsidian table and set down his fork when Celine spoke in the old tongue. Now Valor understood why. "You knew he would recognize you," Valor said. "I know what he is capable of," she said. "I was careful." "You were not careful last night." A silence. Something moved through her eyes. Not regret exactly, something more complicated. "No," she said. "I wasn't." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" She looked back at him. "Because," she said very quietly, "I've been waiting 14 months for someone in this palace to actually see me. And when you knocked the goblet, I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought that was worth the risk." The garden was completely silent. Valor stood there with the book and the evening air and the weight of an empire pressing on him from every direction, and a woman standing 2 feet away who had just said one of the most honest things anyone had said to him in 11 years of rule, and he did what he always did when the thing in front of him was too complex to resolve in a single moment. He made a decision about the immediate action and left the rest of it to wait. "I'm going to return this to the restricted vault," he said, "and then I'm going to have my private archivist pull every document adjacent to the Ashcroft proceedings from the non-official catalog." She said nothing. "You will not return to archive duty tomorrow," he said. "You will be reassigned to the upper household on my authority. This is not a reward. It is a practical measure to ensure your location can be verified while this is reviewed." She understood what he meant. He meant he was putting her somewhere he could see her, for her protection or for his, possibly for both. And she was smart enough to know he hadn't decided which yet. "Yes, Your Radiance," she said. He turned to go. He had taken 3 steps when he stopped. He didn't entirely understand why. Something about the garden, something about the particular quality of what she had said. "I've been waiting for someone in this palace to actually see me," that sat differently from the way information normally sat in him. He turned back. "Celine Ashcroft," he said, in the old tongue, formally, in the way you use someone's full name in the compact language when you want the sentence to carry weight. She looked at him. "What you did at that table 2 nights ago," he said, "speaking in that register, correcting me in front of the court." She waited. "It was either the bravest thing I've seen in 11 years, he said, "or the most dangerous." She held his gaze for a moment. "My father," she said, "used to say that those 2 things were usually the same thing." He stood there with that. Then he left. He went back through the garden door and up the corridor with the book under his arm and the sealed note already mentally composed to cassock that would redirect the investigation from general background to the specific documentary irregularities in the Ashcroft proceedings timeline. He was 3 corridors away when Lord Malrek Thornwick stepped out of a side doorway in the manner of a man who had been waiting. He was a large man, Thornwick, broad across the chest, with a face built for expressing confidence, and a pair of eyes that were always doing something entirely different from his face. He smiled when he saw Valor. It was the smile of a man who had just seen something he hadn't expected and was working very quickly to understand what it meant. "Your Radiance," he said smoothly. "A late evening walk." "Thornwick," Valor said, and kept walking. Thornwick fell into step beside him, a liberty that most lords wouldn't have taken, and that Thornwick had learned he could take, because Valor found direct confrontation more useful than protocol when he needed to read someone. "I noticed," Thornwick said, "that the household attendant from the banquet has not been formally censured." "No," Valor said. "The court will find that unusual." "The court," Valor said, "can find it whatever they like." Thornwick was quiet for 2 steps. "She's an interesting girl," he said. "The attendant. I've seen her in the archive corridor." Valor said nothing. "Curious hobby for a servant," Thornwick said. "All those old texts." Valor stopped. He looked at Thornwick directly, with the full weight of what 11 years on the throne had taught him about letting someone know, without saying it, that he saw exactly what they were doing. Thornwick's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes did. Just for a moment. Just enough. "Get some sleep, Malrek," Valor said. He walked away. Behind him, he heard nothing. The silence of a man standing in a corridor doing very rapid calculations. He was halfway to his private chambers when the runner found him, a young palisade, slightly breathless, with a folded note on a silver tray. From Kasich. Which was unusual, because Valor had only sent the note that afternoon, and Kasich's preliminary findings normally took 2 days minimum. He opened it, read it again. The note contained 4 words and a date. The 4 words were, "The vault was altered." The date was 3 months before the Ashcroft proceedings. 3 months before the trial that had destroyed a family and made Malrek Thornwick one of the wealthiest men in the empire, someone had altered a document in the Imperial Restricted Vault. Valor stood in the corridor with the note in his hand, and the candle sconces throwing long shadows across the stone floor, and the palace moved around him, guards rotating positions, night staff beginning their routines, the empire sleeping or pretending to, and he understood with absolute clarity that he was standing at the beginning of something that was not going to resolve quietly, and that Selene Ashcroft, wherever she was in this building right now, was in a great deal more danger than she knew. He turned back. He was already moving, already calculating the fastest route back to the East Wing and the upper household quarters where he'd sent her, already composing the instruction to his night guard captain, when one of his personal details stepped forward from the shadows at the corridor junction. The guard's face was wrong. Not wrong in a way that could be explained. Wrong in the way that Valor had learned, over 11 years of surviving a throne that people wanted him off of, to recognize as immediately significant. The guard said, "Your Radiance, there has been an incident in the upper household wing." Valor went very still. "What kind of incident?" he said. The guard said, "The attendant reassigned this evening. She's gone." The corridor seemed to contract. "Gone," Valor repeated. "Her room was cleared, quickly. The window was open." The guard paused. "There were 2 men seen in the service corridor below approximately 20 minutes ago. They have not been identified." Valor looked at the note in his hand. The vault was altered. He looked at his guard. He said, very quietly, with the cold precision of a man who has just understood that something he did not know he was protecting has been put in danger, "Find her." He had learned early, Throne Year 2, an assassination attempt in the lower courtyard that he had survived by not panicking, that running communicated to everyone around you that the situation was beyond your control. And the moment a king communicated that, it became true. He walked, fast, with purpose, in the way that men who command armies walk when something has gone wrong and they intend to correct it, not fleeing toward anything, but moving with the specific gravity of someone who has already decided what happens next. "How long?" he said. His night guard captain, Davin Solt, fell into step beside him. Solt was a compact man, built economically, with a face that had been rearranged by 2 separate fights and had settled into something that conveyed extremely reliable competence. He had served in Valor's personal detail for 7 years and had never once given him a comforting lie. "The room was checked at the 2nd evening bell," Solt said. "She was present. At the 3rd bell she was gone. That's a window of roughly 40 minutes. The 2 men in the service corridor. Gone before we could identify them. The door at the corridor's end was forced, latch bent inward. Someone came in, not out." Valor processed this. Came in meant she hadn't run on her own initiative. It meant she'd been taken or she'd been warned and moved herself before they could take her. And both of those possibilities had Thornwick's fingerprints on them in ways that made something cold and focused settle in his chest. "She wasn't running," he said. Solt glanced at him. "If she ran," Valor said, "she had 14 months to do it. She didn't run. Someone moved on her." "The window was open," Solt said carefully. "From inside or outside?" A pause. "We're checking." "Check faster." Valor turned a corner. "Pull every entrance log from the service corridor for the past 6 hours. I want names against faces. Every single one." "Your Radiance." Solt peeled off. Valor kept moving. He was aware with a cold clarity that he'd learned not to mistake for anything sentimental, that what he felt right now was not strictly political. It wasn't the clean, functional concern of a king managing a security problem. It was something with more pressure behind it, something that had been building since a woman in gray livery had corrected him in a language she had no business knowing and held his gaze without flinching and said, with a steadiness that most of his lords couldn't manage, that the evidence in his own vaults contradicted an official record that had destroyed her family. He had believed her. He still believed her. And someone in his palace, someone who had moved fast within 20 minutes of Valor reassigning her to the upper household, had decided she needed to disappear before he could act on it. The speed of that bothered him most. 20 minutes meant the order had been waiting. It meant whoever gave it had known before tonight that Celine Ashcroft was in the palace, had been watching her, had been allowing her to remain as long as she stayed invisible and harmless. And the moment she stopped being invisible, the order went out. Which meant the banquet had been a signal. Which meant that Thornwyke, who had been sitting at that table when she spoke in the old tongue, had recognized her and spent the last 2 days deciding what to do about it. Valor reached the upper household corridor and stopped. The room was small. A servant's room, narrow bed, a shelf, one window that faced the inner courtyard. The window was open. The shelf was cleared except for a single item, a folded piece of paper, set in the center of the shelf with the deliberate precision of something placed, not abandoned. He crossed to it, picked it up, unfolded it. 4 lines, written in the sacred Alpha tongue, in a hand that was careful and small and had been taught by someone who understood the grammatical weight of every stroke. The vault record has been altered twice. The second alteration is dated 8 days before the proceedings closed. The original seal signature does not match the court recorder on file. I know where the comparison document is. If I am gone when you read this, look in the East Archive sublevel. 3rd cabinet, the one with the broken hinge. Below that, 1 more line. I was not running from you. Valor stood in the empty room with the note and the open window and the cold air moving through it, and something settled in him that was harder and quieter than anger. Anger was loud. This was not loud. This was the particular internal stillness of a man who has just understood the shape of something that has been hidden in his own house and intends to remove it. He folded the note, put it in his interior coat pocket against his chest, went to find the East Archive sublevel. The sublevel was not on the official palace map. This was not a secret. It was simply not included. The way that utility corridors and coal storage and the older structural passages of a building that had been built over 7 reigns were not included on the formal architectural record. Valor knew it existed because he had walked every corridor of this palace in his first year as king, alone, at night, systematically, until he understood the physical truth of the building he was responsible for, rather than the presented version of it. The East Archive sublevel was reached through a passage off the main catalog room, down a half staircase that required a specific key. Valor had the key. He had keys to every room in this palace. Another first-year decision, made after he'd discovered that his predecessor had allowed 3 separate locked areas to exist that the king himself couldn't access without requesting permission from the relevant department head. He had corrected that immediately. The sublevel smelled of stone and old paper and the specific dry cold of a space that had been sealed for longer than it had been open. The lantern he'd taken from the corridor cast a pale circle that reached about 10 feet in every direction and left the rest in a dark that pressed back. He moved to the 3rd cabinet. The hinge was broken, bent outward at the bottom, the way a hinge bends when someone has opened a door more times than the mechanism was designed to handle, over a very long time, carefully, trying not to make the damage worse. He opened it. Inside, between 2 cataloging volumes that had been positioned to look like a natural gap in the collection, was a single document in a sealed case. The case was old, but not ancient, perhaps 30 years. The seal on it was the court recorder's mark, the original mark, from the period before the Ashcroft proceedings. He opened the case. Read the document. He read it once. Then he read it again, more slowly, paying specific attention to the signature lines and the date stamps and the witness attestations at the bottom. Then he stood in the cold underground dark with the original covenant verification document in his hands, the one that the altered vault record had claimed no longer existed, and he understood with complete and devastating clarity that Celine Ashcroft's father had not betrayed the crown. He had been destroyed by the crown, by specific men within it, by men who had used the machinery of imperial justice to eliminate a house that stood between them and a very large amount of wealth. Valor put the document back in the case, put the case inside his coat. went back upstairs. He found Solt in the main corridor. "Anything," he said. "The entrance log shows 2 names against that corridor in the relevant window," Solt said. "Both are household maintenance staff. Both are registered to Thornwick's city residence as secondary employment." The information landed without surprise, but with weight. "Bring me Thornwick," Valor said. Solt looked at him steadily. "At this hour, Your Radiance?" "At this hour," Valor said. Solt went. Valor went to his private council room. He set both documents on the desk, Cassick's note and the original covenant verification. He sat in the uncomfortable chair and looked at them and thought about Malrek Thornwick, who had been in his court for 11 years and had built a political identity around being consistently, reliably, usefully present. He was on 3 imperial councils. He held advisory positions in 2 border territories. He had survived 3 separate changes in court alignment by the simple method of never committing to any faction so strongly that he couldn't exit cleanly. He was, Valor had always known, fundamentally dangerous. Not in the blunt way of a man who threatens openly, in the architectural way. The way of a man who builds the walls of a situation around you until you look up and realize the room has no door. Thornwick arrived in 22 minutes. He was dressed, which was interesting, not hurriedly, fully, correctly, as if he had either not yet gone to bed or had dressed with unusual speed and care. He came into the council room and stood with the practiced ease of a man who had been summoned to private council many times and had always emerged from it intact. "Your Radiance," he said. "A late hour for council." "Sit down, Malrek." Thornwick sat. He arranged himself in the chair with the specific quality of a large man, making himself appear unhurried in a small space. Valor looked at him. "2 men," he said. "Your household staff, in my service corridor tonight." Thornwick's face arranged itself into something that was not quite confusion and not quite surprise, but was extremely convincing from a distance. "I'm not certain I understand." "I think you do." "Your Radiance, if members of my secondary staff were found—" "They were found," Valor said. "I'm not asking if they were there. I'm telling you that they were, and that I know they're yours, and that I'm giving you one opportunity to tell me what you sent them for." The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that has edges. Thornwick said very carefully, "There was a girl at the banquet who spoke inappropriately to your Radiance in a manner that caused disruption." "She corrected a procedural error," Valor said. "She was right." "Regardless," Thornwick's voice was smooth, controlled, moving like something that had learned to navigate currents. "There have been concerns among certain members of the court about the presence of disruptive elements within the household staff. I may have overstepped in acting on those concerns independently rather than through formal channel. If so, I apologize." Valor looked at him for a long time. Thornwick held it. He was good at holding it. Most men weren't. "The Ashcroft proceedings," Valor said. Something moved in Thornwick's eyes. Fast. Gone. "A closed matter," Thornwick said. "Your father's reign." "The vault record was altered," Valor said. "Twice. The second alteration occurring 8 days before the proceedings closed. The original signature on the covenant verification document does not match the court recorder listed in the official record." Silence. "That's a significant claim," Thornwick said. "It's a documented fact." Valor put Cassick's note on the desk between them. Did not put the original document down. "I have independent verification of the alteration. What I am asking you directly is whether you want to tell me what you know about it before I begin the formal investigative process." Thornwick looked at the note, looked up. "I was a young lord during the Ashcroft proceedings," he said. "I benefited from the redistribution, yes. That was the Crown's decision, not mine. You benefited substantially. Others benefited more." "Name them," Valor said. Thornwick smiled. It was the first time the smile had appeared since he sat down, and it was a different kind of smile from the one he'd worn in the corridor. Smaller, colder, the kind of smile a man produces when he's stopped performing and started calculating. "Your Radiance," he said. "I would encourage caution here. The proceedings were complex. The men involved are deeply embedded in the imperial structure. An investigation of this nature, without careful preparation, would create significant instability. "Are you advising me," Valor said, "or warning me?" The smile stayed. "I would never presume to warn you, Your Radiance." "Then you're advising me. And my response to that advice is to note that I am uninterested in the stability of a structure built on an altered document and a dead man's false conviction." Valor leaned forward slightly. "Find the girl, Malrek, before whoever you sent for her does something that cannot be corrected. Because if she is harmed, the conversation we are currently having, where I'm still asking questions, becomes a different kind of conversation entirely." Thornwick was very still. "I don't know where she is," he said. "Find out," Valor said. "You have until dawn." Thornwick stood. He straightened his coat with the same careful precision he'd brought to sitting. His face was composed. His eyes were doing something entirely private. "Your Radiance," he said, and left. Valor sat in the council room after the door closed and listened to the silence of the palace at depth of night, the structure settling, the distant shift change of the outer guard, the total absence of the sounds that filled it during daylight. And he looked at the space on his desk where the original document was not, because it was in his coat against his chest, where it would stay until he had a secure location for it that was not in any vault that Thornwick or anyone connected to him could reach. He was 34 years old. He had been king for 11 years. He had managed crises, suppressed threats, rebuilt a treasury, and restructured 2 failing provinces and executed a border lord and survived 6 uprisings. He had done all of it with the clean, functional machinery of a man who treated governance as a problem to be solved. Right now, for the first time in a very long time, the problem was not clean. The problem was a woman who had spent 14 months in his archive cataloging section, reading original compact texts and building a case against one of his most powerful lords, and waiting. Waiting in the extraordinary patience of someone who had decided that the only tool available to her was endurance, for someone in this palace to see her. And someone had seen her, and sent men for her within 20 minutes. And she had left him a note in the sacred Alpha tongue because she had known before he did that the situation was going to move faster than either of them expected. He reached into his coat and touched the document case. The original seal. The original signature. The proof that an empire had been used as a weapon against a man who had not deserved it. He thought about what she had said in the garden. My father believed his daughter should be equipped to survive anything. He thought about what it took to be 22 years old and the last surviving member of a family the empire had decided to erase, and to spend 14 months in that empire's own palace, in its own archive, dismantling the lie from the inside. He thought about the note she had left him. "I was not running from you." He picked up the lantern on his desk, stood. He went to find Solt. "I need 6 men," he said. "Not palace guard. Mine. The ones who answer to me and not to the household command structure." Solt nodded once. He had known Valor long enough to not ask for explanation when the instruction was clear. "And I need the city perimeter contacts activated," Valor said. "Every gate, every monitored exit. If she's still inside the walls, I want to know it before dawn. If she's outside—" He stopped. "If she's outside," Solt said carefully, "then we have a different problem." Valor looked at him. "She is not to be intercepted by anyone but my people. Anyone else who finds her first answers to me directly. Is that understood?" "Understood," Solt said. Valor moved toward the door, stopped, said, without turning around, "She left me a note, Davin, in the old tongue." Solt waited. "She knew they were coming for her," Valor said. "She had time to write and time to run, and she used part of that time to make sure I found the document." He paused. "She trusted me to act on it." "Is she right to?" Solt said. Not a challenge, a real question, the kind Solt had been asking him for 7 years because Solt was one of approximately 3 people in the Empire who was permitted to ask it. Valor thought about altered vault records and a dead man's false conviction, and Thornwick's cold smile and the weight of an original document against his chest. "Find her," he said, "and yes." He walked out into the pre-dawn corridor with the palace dark around him, and the Empire pressing down from every direction, and the first thin edge of morning beginning to show itself at the far windows. And somewhere in the city or the palace or the dark between those two things, Celine Ashcroft was either running or hiding or already in the hands of people who had spent 11 years trying to make sure the truth she carried stayed buried. He had the document. He had the note. He had independent verification of an alteration in his own vaults. What he did not have was her. And without her, the document was evidence. With her, it was a reckoning. He was halfway down the main corridor when Solt appeared from the far end at something faster than his usual measured pace. Not running, but close, with the quality of motion that Solt reserved for situations that required him to reach the king before the king reached the situation. "Your Radiance," Solt said. Something in his voice. Valor went still. "She's in the palace," Solt said. "She didn't leave. She's in the lunar vaults." Valor's chest did something irregular. "The vaults are sealed." "Yes," Solt said. "She's inside them." The lunar vault, the oldest section of the palace, predating the current structure by 2 centuries, built into the foundational stone of the original Iron Fang compound, were sealed by a mechanism that required the Alpha King's sigil ring and a secondary key held by the head archivist. No one entered them without both. The head archivist was a 70-year-old man named Corvin who had not, to anyone's knowledge, left his quarters after the 9th evening bell in 15 years, which meant Celine Ashcroft had found another way in, which meant she had been planning for this longer than one night. Valor looked at Solt. "She's not hiding," he said. He understood it even as he said it, the particular shape of it clicking into place. "She went to the vaults because that's where the rest of it is." Solt waited. "The second alteration," Valor said, "the one 8 days before the proceedings closed. The original, the document that proves the alteration happened. It's not in the sub-level cabinet. It's in the vaults." He looked at Solt. "She's been inside the vaults before. She knows exactly what's in there." "Your Radiance," Solt said with the tone of a man flagging a significant operational concern. "If Thornwick has any visibility on the vault monitoring—" "He does," Valor said. He was already moving. "He's on the Archive Oversight Council. He has visibility on everything in this palace except the things I've personally restricted." He walked faster. "Which means the moment she triggered whatever entry mechanism she found, someone in Thornwick's network was notified." Solt moved with him, matching pace. "We have perhaps 15 minutes before anyone he sends could reach the vault level." "Then we have 15 minutes, Valor said. They went down. The vault entrance was at the base of the old tower, stone stairs that had been worn smooth by centuries and then simply stopped being used, so that the smoothness felt more like abandonment than wear. The door was iron, original, with the dual mechanism lock that had not been opened, by official record, in 14 months. There was a light under it, faint, steady. Someone with a lantern on the other side. Valor put his sigil ring to the mechanism. The second lock required the archivist's key, and he did not have it. He looked at the door. He looked at Solt. Solt produced from the interior of his coat a key on a plain iron ring. Valor looked at it. "Corvan," Solt said simply, "asked me to hold this 14 months ago. He said, and I am quoting directly, 'If the king ever needs to go in without the ceremony, give him this and don't mention it to the Archive Council.'" Valor took the key. "Corvan has known she was here," he said. "I believe so," Solt said. He thought about Corvan, the 70-year-old archivist who had served 4 kings and never once been involved in anything political, who had given his secondary vault key to a personal guard captain without explanation 14 months ago, who had presumably watched a young woman arrive in his archive section and understood something about her that he had decided, quietly, to accommodate. He turned the second lock. The door opened. The lunar vaults were not what the name suggested. There was nothing lunar about them except the carved wolf and moon motif on the original stone pillars, which dated to the founding and had been built as pure architecture rather than symbol. The space was low-ceilinged and extensive, running deeper than the tower footprint in a series of chambered rooms, each one cooler and drier than the last. The original compact texts lived here, the founding documents, the sealed testimonies of the first Alpha Councils, And in the third chamber, kneeling before an open cabinet with a lantern on the stone floor beside her and a document spread open across her knees, was Celine Ashcroft. She looked up when he entered. She was not surprised. She had known he would come. The calculation was in her face, had been there for long enough that it had settled into something quieter than calculation, something more like resolution. "How long have you known about this room?" he said. "Since month 4, she said. "Corvin showed me." "Corvin?" "He knew my father." She looked back at the document in her hands. "He said he'd been waiting for someone to come looking. He didn't know it would take this long." Valor crossed the chamber, looked down at the document she held. It was a testimony. A sealed original witness testimony from the Ashcroft proceedings. Not the official version, not the altered version. The original, with the original signatures, which named different border faction contacts than the official record and provided alibi attestation for Lord Edrin Ashcroft during the specific dates he was accused of conspiring. And beneath it, in a different hand, a secondary document, a private correspondence between 2 lords from the year of the proceedings, discussing the redistribution of Ashcroft holdings and the specific steps required to ensure the legal challenge would not survive. 2 of the names in that correspondence were Thornwick. The third name Valor looked at for a long time. It was not a name he had expected. It was a name that changed the shape of everything he thought he had understood about the proceedings, and about the current court, and about exactly how deeply this corruption had been built into his empire. He straightened. Celine was watching him. "You knew about the third name," he said. "Yes," she said. "How long?" 3 months. Her voice was level. "I've been waiting to see if I could verify it independently before I told anyone." "Could you?" "Yes." She reached into the cabinet and produced a second document, a land transfer record with a signature that matched the private correspondence hand. "This confirms it." Valor stood in the cold underground chamber with the evidence of a decades-long conspiracy spread across the stone floor, and a woman who had spent over a year inside his palace dismantling it piece by piece, and the third name burned in his mind with the specific cold fire of something that was going to require him to make decisions that would reshape the court and possibly the empire, and that could not be walked back once made. He heard footsteps on the stairs above. More than one person, moving fast, not bothering to be quiet, which meant they already knew someone was here and had stopped caring about discretion. Celine heard them too. She rose from the floor and gathered the documents against her chest, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been running a very long race, and has just reached the point where running stops being possible. "Your Radiance," she said. "Stay behind me," he said. She said, "There are at least 4 of them. I heard them at the corridor entrance." "I know." This is Thornwick's response. Her voice was steady, but her breath had shortened. Not fear, or not only fear, but the sharp physical awareness of a situation that has just closed around both of them. "He moved faster than you expected." "Yes," Valor said. He looked at the vault door, at the documents she was holding, at the specific position of the single chamber entrance and the stone walls on every other side, and the distance between their current location and the stairs. He made the calculation. Then he turned and looked at Celine Ashcroft with the full attention of a man who has stopped managing a situation and started deciding what he is actually willing to do. "Give me the documents," he said. She handed them to him without hesitation. All of them. He put them inside his coat with the original case against his chest and straightened, and in the lantern light of the oldest room in his empire, with the footsteps getting louder on the stairs above, he turned to face the door. And for the first time in 11 years, he was not standing there as a king managing a problem. He was standing there as a man who had decided what he was protecting. The door opened. 4 men came through it. They were not palace guard. They were dressed in plain clothing, the kind of nondescript that costs effort, and the one in front had the particular build and particular blankness of a man who was paid specifically to resolve situations without leaving a record of how. He looked at Valor. Something moved through his face. The rapid recalculation of a man who was sent to deal with a servant girl and has just encountered the Alpha King of the Iron Fang Empire, standing between him and her in a sealed vault with the expression of someone who has run out of patience entirely. "Your radiance," the man said. The words had no shape. They were just sound filling the silence where his plan used to be. Valor looked at him. "You have one choice," he said. "Tell me who sent you, right now, and walk out of this palace under your own power, or don't." The man looked at the three men behind him, looked back at Valor. In his eyes, not fear of the king, not exactly, but the specific terror of a man caught between two forces he cannot survive and trying to determine which one is more immediately lethal. His mouth opened, and behind Valor, Celine Ashcroft said very quietly, "He won't tell you. He can't. Thornwick doesn't send men who can talk." The man's expression confirmed it before he could stop it, and then, in a single motion that resolved the calculation completely, he stepped forward. The man stepped forward, and Valor hit him, not with the measured, calculated force of a king managing a situation, with the compact, economical violence of someone who has run out of room for anything else. One strike, elbow to the jaw, and the man's head snapped sideways, and he went down against the stone floor with a sound that settled the question of whether he was getting back up immediately. The three behind him had a half-second to process this. Valor used the half-second. He moved left toward the cabinet wall, which forced the remaining three to reorganize their approach. They'd entered expecting to find a servant girl, and the geometry of three men in a low-ceilinged vault coming at a single target who knew how to use the walls required a different formation than they'd prepared for. The reorganization cost them 2 more seconds. Solt came through the door. He brought 2 of Valor's personal detail with him, and what happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean or elegant, but it was effective. And when it was finished, all 4 men were on the floor, and Celine Ashcroft was standing against the far cabinet with her arms crossed over her chest, holding a stone fragment she'd picked up from the floor at some point during the exchange. Her breathing fast and her eyes bright with the particular sharpness of a person whose body has just flooded itself with everything it produces when survival becomes immediate. She looked at the 4 men on the floor. She looked at Valor. "You hit him first," she said. "He moved first," Valor said. "You hit him before he finished moving." Valor straightened his coat. "Semantics." Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. Then it was gone, because the situation hadn't resolved. It had only paused. Solt was already binding the men's hands with the cord he carried in his kit, the way a man carries cord when he has worked personal security long enough to know that improvisation is slower than preparation. He worked efficiently, without commentary, and when he was done, he looked at Valor with the expression of a man waiting for the next instruction. "The corridor above," Valor said. "Are there more?" "Unknown," Solt said. "Possibly. Thornwick would not have sent 4 if he thought 4 was sufficient." Valor looked at Celine, but she was still holding the stone fragment. Her knuckles were not white. She was not gripping it with fear, but with the considered readiness of someone who had decided it was useful and hadn't yet decided to put it down. He noted this. "We need to move the documents," he said. "Out of the vaults, out of the archive level, somewhere that is not in any building infrastructure that Thornwick has oversight access to." "Your private chambers," Solt said. "Too obvious. It's the first place a counter move targets." Valor thought. "The North Tower garrison room. My personal security uses it. It's off the household management structure entirely." Solt nodded. Valor turned to Celine. "Can you walk fast?" "I've been walking fast for 14 months, she said. They went. The corridor above the vaults was empty, which meant either Thornwick had sent only the 4 or the others were positioned further up and hadn't been notified that the 4 had failed yet. Either way, the window was real and finite. Valor moved through it with Celine immediately behind him and Solt's 2 men flanking, and they took the secondary passage, the one that wasn't on the official map, the one Valor had found in his first-year walkthrough, that cut through the old utility corridor and bypassed the main east wing entirely. The palace at this hour was not empty, but it was thin. Kitchen staff. Night patrol rotations. The occasional secretary working late on something that couldn't wait. None of them looked up as the small group moved through. The garrison room was on the third level of the North Tower, behind a door that looked like a storage entrance and opened into a space equipped for exactly the kind of situation that didn't appear in any official record. Valor had equipped it himself. It had a secure cabinet, a secondary seal lock, and enough supply for 3 days if a situation required it. He put the documents in the cabinet, sealed it, looked at Celine. She was standing in the center of the room, the stone fragment finally set down on the table beside her, her arms loose at her sides now. She looked exhausted in the way that people look exhausted, not from physical effort, but from the sustained weight of carrying something for a very long time and having it suddenly, not resolved, not yet, but shifted into other hands. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He pulled the chair opposite and sat across from her. He looked at her directly, in the way he rarely looked at anyone, without the political layer, without the management apparatus, without the 11-year accumulation of calculated distance. Just looking. "The third name," he said. "In the private correspondence. Tell me what you know about how it connects." She told him. It took 9 minutes. She spoke with the economy of someone who has organized their information over a long period and knows exactly which sequence makes the clearest picture. No unnecessary detail, no emotional editorializing, just the architecture of it, laid out with the precision of a woman who had been educated to think before speaking and had spent 14 months making sure every piece was verified before she trusted it to words. When she finished, the room was quiet. Valor sat with what she had told him. The third name was Lord Edric Vane. Edric Vane, who was not on any archive oversight council, and not in any Thornwyke correspondence that the official record contained. Edric Vane, who had been Violor's father's closest advisor during the Ashcroft proceedings, and who had, 11 years ago, been the man who presented the case for the redistribution of Ashcroft holdings to the new young king, to Valor himself, in his first months on the throne. When he had been 23 years old and had trusted his father's inner circle as the men who knew the empire's workings, and his own inexperience made him reliant on their guidance. Edric Vane, who currently served as Valor's senior imperial counselor, who had an office 40 feet from Valor's council room, who had attended the Moon Covenant banquet 3 days ago and had said, when Celine spoke in the old tongue, absolutely nothing, had sat with his hands folded and his face composed and said nothing at all, with the specific quality of a man who is very carefully not reacting. Valor understood, with the cold shock of something that reorders every prior piece of information, that he had been trusting one of the architects of this conspiracy for 11 years. That the man who had advised him through 6 uprisings and 2 dissolved councils and the restructuring of the imperial treasury had been, for all of that time, a man with a vested interest in ensuring that the truth underneath the Ashcroft proceedings stayed buried. He had sat in Vane's counsel, had used Vane's analysis, had made decisions shaped by Vane's framing of situations, what information to wait, which lords to trust, which alliances to pursue. He thought about how many things he had decided over 11 years with Edric Vane's voice in his ear, and the calculation of what that meant spread outward from the single point of the Ashcroft conspiracy into something much larger and much colder. A king could be isolated, not by force. An alpha king couldn't be isolated by force, but by architecture, by the careful, patient construction of a council structure that filled every decision point with people who were managed by a shared interest in the king, never looking too closely at certain things. You didn't need to control a king's will. You only needed to control his information. Valor had believed for 11 years that he was governing an empire. He understood now that he had been governing the version of it that certain men had agreed he should see. He sat with this. Celine was watching him. She was not rushing him. She had the patience of a person who had sat with this knowledge for months and understood that it required time to settle. "How certain are you, Tet?" he said. The correspondence signature matches the land transfer document, matches an independent witness statement from a border province recorder who documented a meeting between Vane and Thornwyke in the month before the proceedings opened. Her voice was level. "I am certain." The border province recorder are they still alive? "She," Celine said. "And yes." She's 73 and she lives in Halvern province, and she has kept a copy of that record in her personal archive because she is the kind of woman who keeps records of things that feel wrong. A pause. My father trained me to find people like that. Valor looked at her. Your father sounds like a remarkable man, he said. Something moved through her eyes. Not grief, or not only grief, something harder, more permanent. He believed that truth was the only thing that couldn't be permanently altered, she said. Even when they alter the documents, the truth is still in the world somewhere, in someone's memory, in a provincial recorder's archive, in the original documents that they didn't know existed because they didn't know what my father had already put away before they moved against him. He knew they were coming, Valor said. He knew something was coming. He didn't know when. She was quiet for a moment. He hid copies of the founding compact verification in 3 places. The Lunar Vault was one of them. He knew about the vault because the Ashcroft house was one of the original founding bloodlines. We had legitimate access before. She stopped. Before. Valor looked at the sealed cabinet where the documents were. He looked at the door. He thought about Edric Vane, who would arrive at his office in approximately 4 hours and would, if Thornwick had communicated with him tonight, already know that the 4 men sent to the vault had failed, would already be recalibrating, would be sitting in his quarters right now, or on his way to Thornwick's, or composing the kind of careful, preemptive move that a man makes when he understands that the situation has changed and he needs to change his position before someone else defines it for him. Valor stood. Stay here, he said to Celine. Solt will be outside the door. Do not open it for anyone except him or me. She looked up at him. What are you going to do? I'm going to speak to Vane, he said. Something shifted in her face. That's... She stopped. Dangerous, he said. Yes. He'll deny it, and you can't move against a senior counselor without a formal proceeding. If he knows you're coming for him, he has time to build a counterposition before you have anything official in front of the council. I know, Valor said. Then why? Because I need to see his face, Valor said, when he doesn't know I have the documents. She was quiet for a moment. You want to know what he does when he thinks he still has room to maneuver, she said. I want to know who else, Valor said. Thornwick, Vane, those are 2. A conspiracy of 2 men doesn't run for 11 years without more architecture. I need to know the full shape of it before I move, and the only way I get that is from Vane thinking he still has time. She looked at him steadily. And if he's already past that point, if Thornwick already told him about the vault, then the conversation will be different, Valor said, but still informative. He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. Celine, he said, her name in the old tongue, not the formal construction, not the court register, just her name, with the weight that names carry when someone says them and means them. She looked at him. I'm going to need you to testify, he said. Not tonight, not yet, but when this reaches the renewal assembly, and it will, I'm going to need you to stand in front of the court and say what you told me. Her chin came up slightly. The motion of a person who has already made this decision and is simply waiting for someone to confirm it's required. I know, she said. You understand what that means, standing there publicly. I understand, she said. I've been preparing for it for 14 months. A pause. My father prepared me for it before that. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he left. Vane's quarters were in the senior counselor wing, 1 floor below the royal apartments. A proximity that had been a mark of trust and was now, Valor thought, as he moved through the pre-dawn corridor, a proximity that had been a structural choice. Keep the most trusted advisor close, which meant keep the most effective intelligence gatherer close, which meant Edric Vane had spent 11 years 40 feet from every decision Valor made, in a position to know, in advance, when any investigation might threaten to approach certain subjects. He knocked once. A long pause. Then footsteps. Vane opened the door. He was dressed. Not quickly. Fully, in the way that Thornwick had been dressed when summoned, and Valor clocked this with the specific attention of a man who has learned to read the small signals that people don't know they're sending. Vane was 61, a lean, upright man with gray at his temples, and the kind of face that had been authoritative for so long that it wore authority like a structural feature. He had clear eyes and a considered manner, and in 11 years Vaelor had never once seen him lose his composure. He looked at Vaelor standing in his doorway at 4 in the morning, and something happened in those clear eyes. Not guilt, not fear. Something much more controlled than either of those. The rapid recalibration of a supremely practiced intelligence, assessing situation and angle and option in the space between one heartbeat and the next, producing an expression by the time he spoke that was entirely plausible, entirely appropriate, and entirely manufactured. "Your Radiance," he said. "Has something happened?" "There was an incident in the archive level tonight," Vaelor said. He watched Vane's face with the full attention of a man who has been lied to expertly for 11 years and is now filtering everything through that knowledge. 4 men were found in the Lunar Vault access corridor, household credentials, but unverified. I wanted to inform you directly. Vane's expression arranged itself into the correct shape. Concerned, attentive, the senior counselor receiving a security briefing. "That is deeply concerning. Have they been identified?" "We're working on it," Vaelor said. "The vault content is anything." "The vault is secure," Vaelor said. Vane exhaled, short, just enough. "Good. In that case, I would suggest we convene a security review in the morning. With your permission, I'll coordinate with the Archive Oversight Council to—" "Malrek Thornwyck chairs the Archive Oversight Council," Vaelor said. A pause. Half a second. In 11 years, Vaelor had never seen Edric Vane pause half a second before a response. "He does," Vane said, "though given the nature of the incident, it might be appropriate to conduct the review through a separate channel." "Why?" Vaelor said. Vane looked at him. "Propriety, Your Radiance. If the men were operating with household credentials, the review should be independent of—" "Edric," Vaelor said. He said it quietly. Not with anger. Anger would have been a signal, would have given Vane a direction to move. He said it with the flat, absolute, zero-temperature quality of a man who has stopped performing and is simply looking at the person in front of him and letting them know it. Vane went still. For 2 full seconds he was completely, perfectly still, and in those 2 seconds Vaelor watched him make a calculation. Not whether to maintain the performance. The calculation was whether the performance still had any ground to stand on. Whether the king in his doorway was working from suspicion or from knowledge. Whether there was still a version of this conversation that Vane could navigate through. He made the wrong choice. "I'm not certain I understand," Vane said, in a voice that was still composed, still measured, still excellent. Vaelor looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "I don't think you are." He left. He walked back down the counselor wing corridor and up the stair, and he didn't move faster or slower than usual, and his face held what he needed it to hold. But underneath that, in the machinery of his thinking, something had changed with the finality of a door that has been closed and locked and the key removed. He had spent 11 years trusting Edric Vane's counsel. He had made decisions that affected the empire, trade structures, border governance, the handling of noble disputes, the allocation of resources, shaped by the framing of a man who had been, throughout all of it, protecting an altered record from a dead man's trial. He could not know, yet, what was real and what had been managed. He could not know how many things he had been kept from seeing, how many situations had been framed to prevent a particular line of inquiry from forming. He knew the Ashcroft proceedings. He did not know what else. And that was the thing that settled in him with the particular weight of something that was not simply anger and not simply betrayal, but something more total. The understanding that a king who cannot trust his own counsel cannot know the shape of his own empire. That the authority he had believed was his had been, in ways he was only beginning to measure, a curated version of itself. That the throne he had governed from for 11 years had been, without his knowledge, partially occupied by people who had needed him to not look too closely at certain things. He arrived back at the North Tower garrison room. Solt was at the door. He looked at Vaelor's face and said nothing. Inside, Celine Ashcroft was sitting exactly where he'd left her, upright, awake, with the focused stillness of someone who has stopped burning energy on anything except readiness. She looked at him when he entered. He already knows, Valor said. She closed her eyes, briefly, opened them. Thornwick told him. Before I got there. He sat down. He was dressed. His first move was to suggest routing the investigation through the Archive Oversight Council, Shisha, through Thornwick. He was trying to give Thornwick control of the investigation. In the first 30 seconds of the conversation, Valor looked at the sealed cabinet. He has been doing this for 11 years, Celine, managing information, shaping what reached me and what didn't. This is not... The Ashcroft proceedings are not the only thing. She was quiet. I don't know what else, he said. That's the problem. I don't know the full scope of what's been filtered, and I cannot begin to know until I have removed the filter. The renewal assembly, she said. Yes, that's 3 weeks away. 3 weeks is enough time to build the formal case if the documents are secure and the testimony from the Halvern province recorder can be obtained. He looked at her. But 3 weeks is also enough time for Thornwick and Vane to build a counterposition if they believe the exposure is coming. They already believe it, she said. The vault. The 4 men. You going to Vane's door at 4 a.m? She paused. They know you know. Yes. Which means the next move is theirs, she said. And it won't be subtle. She was right. He knew it with the specific clarity of a man who has just shown his hand to people who have been playing the game longer and who have still considerably more pieces on the board than he has currently secured. Thornwick had allies across the border territories. Vane had 11 years of access to every significant relationship in the imperial court structure. They would not wait to see how the investigation developed. They would move to reshape the situation before the investigation could take formal shape, which meant they would move to discredit Celine. Publicly, completely, before she could stand before the court. And they would move against Valor's ability to act, not directly, not against the king himself, but against his supporting structure, against Solt, possibly, against Kasich, against anyone who could corroborate the investigation's findings before the assembly convened. He thought about the renewal assembly, the once-yearly gathering of every alpha lord and noble house in the empire, the formal occasion at which imperial decisions were ratified and challenges could be raised. 3 weeks. The one moment in the imperial calendar where what was said publicly could not be easily buried. They were going to try to close that window. He looked at Celine. She was looking back at him with the expression she had worn in the garden, the decision already made quality, the particular steadiness of a person who has been moving toward a specific point for a very long time and can now see it clearly enough to run toward it if necessary. What do you need from me? She said. He thought about what she had already done. The 14 months, the documents, the note in the old tongue, the stone fragment held with practiced readiness in the vault. He thought about her father, who had taught a 6-year-old girl the sacred alpha tongue and hidden copies of founding documents in 3 locations because he understood that truth needed redundancy to survive people who were determined to bury it. I need you, he said, to be prepared to do in 3 weeks what you've been preparing to do since you were 6 years old. She held his gaze. I've been ready, she said, for a long time. The North Tower room was quiet. Outside, the palace was beginning its early morning transition. The first staff arriving, the night guard handing off, the slow machinery of the empire waking up and resuming its functions without any awareness of what had shifted in its foundations in the last several hours. And then Solt opened the door. His face was the particular face of a man delivering news that will change the shape of the conversation. Your Radiance, he said. The Chancellor is requesting an emergency council, all senior advisors. He paused. Lord Vane called it. Valor went very still. On what grounds? He said. Solt met his eyes. He has filed a formal security concern petition against a member of the household staff. Another pause. He has named Celine Ashcroft as a foreign intelligence operative with undisclosed connections to a border faction. He is requesting her immediate detention pending investigation. The room was absolutely silent. Valor looked at Celine. Her face had gone to something beyond shock. The specific expression of a person who has spent 14 months building one structure and has just watched someone lay the first stone of a counterstructure with a speed and precision that means the battle has genuinely, finally, and without any further possibility of quiet resolution, begun. Vane had moved first, and he had moved in the one direction that Veilor had not yet fully secured against: the public, formal, procedural direction, the one that used the Empire's own legal machinery to manufacture the appearance of a threat, to reframe Celine before she could reframe the proceedings, to force Veilor into a position where defending her meant appearing to obstruct a legitimate security proceeding. It was, Veilor thought with cold precision, exactly what he would have done. He stood. "Where's the council convening?" he said. "The main chamber," Solt said. "In 1 hour." Veilor looked at Celine. She was not afraid, or she was afraid and it was sitting in her exactly the way it had sat in her in the vault, not as a thing that stopped her, but as a thing that sharpened her, the way cold air sharpens everything it touches. "Can you walk into that chamber," he said, "in front of every senior advisor in the Empire, and stand there while Vane makes that accusation and not look like someone running?" She raised her chin. "I was born in a house that stood for 2 centuries, she said. "I will not look like someone running in the hall of the Empire that destroyed it." Veilor looked at her for one long moment. Then he made the decision that there was no version of this situation that allowed for anything between full commitment and complete surrender, and Veilor Dreadmore had not surrendered to anything in 11 years and was not prepared to begin. "Then you're coming with me," he said, "to the council." "Yes." Her eyes held his. "They'll use it against you." "They're going to use everything against me," he said. "I would rather they do it while I'm standing in front of them than while I'm trying to manage it from a distance." He looked at Solt. "Bring everything, the documents, the case, all of it. If we're going into that chamber, we're going in with the full record." Solt looked at him steadily. "That means no more preparation time. Once those documents are on the council table, there is no taking them back." "I know," Veilor said. He looked at the sealed cabinet. He thought about Edric Vane filing a formal petition in the hour before dawn, moving with the speed of a man who understands that the window is closing and has decided that attack is the only viable form of defense remaining. He thought about Thornwyke, somewhere in this palace, calculating angles. He thought about the court that would assemble in that chamber in 60 minutes, the advisors and lords and secretaries who made up the governing infrastructure of his empire, many of whom had been inside this architecture of managed information for years without knowing it. He thought about his father, who had trusted Edric Vane, who had made decisions that Vane had shaped, and Veilor was only now, in this room, beginning to trace this particular edge, possibly not known what was done in his name during the Ashcroft proceedings, or possibly had known. He set that aside. One thing at a time, he reached for the sealed cabinet, and from the corridor outside, distant but clear, he heard voices, more than Solt's one guard, more than the normal palace staff, the particular ambient sound of people gathering with diction and purpose, and the specific organizational energy of a formal proceeding being assembled at unusual speed. Vane had called the council fast enough that it had already begun. Veilor unlocked the cabinet, took the documents, held them for a moment in both hands, the original covenant verification, the private correspondence with 3 names on it, the sealed testimony with the dates that didn't match, the land transfer record, all of it, the 14 months of work that a dead man had begun, and his daughter had continued with the patient, absolute, unbreakable conviction that truth was the only thing that couldn't be permanently altered. He looked at Celine. She had stood. She was standing in the center of the garrison room with her hands at her sides and her spine straight, and her face composed into the expression of a woman who has been preparing for this specific moment since before she understood what preparation meant. "Ready," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He moved toward the door. Behind him she followed, and in the main chamber of the Iron Fang Empire, 1 floor below and 40 feet away, Lord Edric Vane, senior imperial counselor, architect of an 11-year deception, the man who had shaped a king's governance from the inside, stood at the head of the council table and waited, with the practiced patience of a man who had always controlled the room, for a proceeding that he believed he had already won. He did not yet know what was in those documents. He did not yet know that Veilor Dreadmore was coming through the door with all of it. And he did not yet know, could not yet know, that the servant girl he had ordered detained was walking beside the Alpha King of the Iron Fang Empire, with the founding compact verification pressed against the king's chest, and 14 months of truth about to enter a room that had been built on lies. The corridor outside was filling with sound. Valor walked toward it. The main chamber doors were open. Valor could hear it before he reached them. The particular compressed sound of a room full of powerful people who have been assembled quickly and don't yet know why, which produced a specific ambient tension, like a string pulled tight but not yet struck. He walked toward it with the documents against his chest, and Celine 1 step behind him and Solt 2 steps behind her with the case containing the secondary materials, and the corridor narrowed toward the chamber entrance, and the sound grew, and he did not slow down. He went through the doors. The chamber held 31 people, senior advisors, departmental heads, 2 border council representatives who had apparently been in the palace for the week's standing meetings and had been caught by Vane's emergency summons. They were standing in the loose, agitated configuration of people who have been pulled from sleep or near sleep and are processing the situation through the fog of it. At the head of the long table, Edric Vane stood with his hands flat on the oak surface and his face composed into the expression of a man conducting necessary and regrettable business. Thornwick was there, positioned to the right and slightly behind Vane, not at the table's head, not claiming leadership, but close enough to function as visible support. His face was arranged into something that was almost concerned, almost. Seraphine Valhart was there too, which meant someone had thought to include her, which meant this had been planned with more coordination than a single hour suggested. She stood near the window in pale morning light and looked at Violor when he entered with the particular expression of a woman who is watching a situation develop and has not yet decided which side of it she intends to occupy. Every head in the room turned when Valor came through the doors, and then they saw who was behind him. The sound in the room changed. Not louder, quieter, actually. The compression of 31 people recalibrating simultaneously, the ambient tension pulling tighter as they processed the fact that the Alpha King had walked into an emergency security council with the woman named in the security concern petition walking beside him. Vane's hands, flat on the table, pressed down by a fraction. Valor walked to the table's head and stood there. He did not sit. He stood at the head of his table in his own chamber and looked at the room with the full, unmediated attention of a man who has stopped managing the distance between himself and a problem and has decided to stand directly inside it. "Lord Vane," he said, "you called this council." Vane straightened. His voice, when it came, was exactly what it had always been, measured, authoritative, carrying the weight of long experience. "Your Radiance, yes. Given the security incident in the archive level tonight, and the identification of the individual at its center, I felt it was necessary to convene the individual at its center," Valor said. "The household attendant, Celine Ashcroft." Vane's gaze moved to her briefly, with the controlled assessment of a man looking at something he has decided is a problem and is explaining why. "Who has, upon investigation by my office, been found to have undisclosed connections to foreign interests operating along the northern border. Who accessed restricted materials without authorization. Who is standing in this room," Valor said, "because I brought her here." Vane paused. Half a second. The same half second as before. "Your Radiance," he said carefully, "I understand there may be aspects of this situation that present as more complex than they are. It would not be the first time that a person with a specific agenda has presented themselves in a manner designed to create confusion about their actual purpose." The room was very still. Valor looked at Vane with the specific quality of attention he had spent the last 3 hours developing. The attention of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at and is no longer pretending otherwise. "Put the documents on the table, Davin," he said. Solt moved forward. He set the case on the table and opened it, and the room watched as he laid out the documents with the methodical precision of a man who understands that the sequence matters. The original covenant verification first, then the private correspondence, then the sealed testimony, then the land transfer record. Valor watched Vane's face as each document appeared. The covenant verification produced a controlled stillness. The private correspondence produced the first crack, a micro-contraction around Vane's eyes, gone in less than a second, but visible to anyone watching closely enough. The sealed testimony produced nothing on his face, which was itself a signal, because a man who genuinely did not know what these documents were would have reacted to them. Vane knew exactly what they were. He had known they existed, had known for years that the possibility of their surfacing was the single greatest risk to everything he and Thornwick had built. And he had managed that risk by managing the man who sat on the throne, keeping him oriented toward other things, shaping his attention, ensuring that certain lines of inquiry never fully formed, until a girl in gray livery had spoken in the old tongue at a banquet, and the king had looked at her. Vialor picked up the private correspondence, held it so the room could see it without reading it clearly. "This document," he said, "is a private correspondence between two lords written in the year of the Ashcroft proceedings. It describes in specific terms the steps taken to ensure that Lord Adrian Ashcroft's legal challenge to the treason charges could not survive." He paused. "It names the men involved, their roles, and the financial arrangements that were made contingent on the successful redistribution of Ashcroft holdings." The room had gone to the quality of silence that has physical weight. "It bears 3 signatures," Vialor said. "Lord Malrek Thornwick, an intermediary whose name I will enter into formal record, and Lord Edric Vane." Thornwick moved. Not toward Vialor, not directly. He moved the way a man moves when he has decided that the shape of the situation has changed and the position he was occupying is no longer viable. He shifted back slightly, putting fractional distance between himself and the table, between himself and Vane, the instinctive spatial politics of a man beginning to separate himself from a sinking structure. Vane saw it. Something crossed his face that Vialor had never seen there in 11 years. Not quite fear, and not quite anger, but the particular expression of a man who has just watched the floor of his position give way and is still, out of sheer practiced reflex, trying to find solid ground. "That document," Vane said, and his voice was still controlled, still carrying the residue of decades of authority, "is not authenticated. Its provenance is unknown. The signature cannot be verified without—" "The signature matches," Celine said. Every head in the room turned to her. She was standing at Vialor's left, not behind him, beside him, which was not a position she had been assigned and which she had taken with the quiet, absolute deliberateness of someone who has spent 14 months preparing for exactly this moment and is not going to occupy the wrong amount of space in it. Her voice was level. Her hands were at her sides. Her chin was up at the angle that Vialor had first seen in the garden, the angle of a person who has made a fundamental decision about who they are going to be and has not moved from it. "The signature matches the authenticated correspondence held in the Halvern Province Recorder's Archive," she said. "A sworn and dated record, maintained by an independent provincial official, documenting a meeting between Thornwick and Vane in the month before the Ashcroft proceedings opened. The provincial recorder is alive, her archive is intact, and she has agreed to provide testimony." She looked at Vane directly. "I corresponded with her 6 weeks ago." The room processed this. Vialor watched Thornwick's face complete its recalculation. He watched the moment when Thornwick understood that the provincial recorder existed and was willing to testify, and that this meant the correspondence was independently corroborated, and that independent corroboration meant the document was not a fabrication and could not be argued as one, and that the full architecture of what they had built was not going to survive contact with the renewal assembly in 3 weeks. Thornwick made a decision. "This is extraordinary," he said. His voice was loud, deliberately, performatively loud, pitched for the room rather than for Vialor. "Your Radiance, I must formally object. This woman is the subject of an active security concern petition. Her presence in this chamber, presenting materials of unknown origin. This is precisely the kind of manipulation that the petition was intended to prevent. She has managed to—" "Malrek," Vialor said. One word. Quiet. Thornwick stopped. Vialor looked at him across the table with the 11 years of a throne between them and the cold specific knowledge of what this man had done, and the particular hard-edged clarity that comes to a person when they have finished deciding something and have nothing left to decide. You sent men to my vault, he said. 4 of them, with your household credentials. At 20 minutes past the moment I reassigned Celine Ashcroft to the upper household. He let that sit for 1 second. The speed of that tells me you were watching her, not for 2 days, for longer. You knew who she was before she spoke at the banquet. Thornwick's jaw was tight. How long? Valor said. Silence. How long did you know she was in my palace, Malrek? The silence stretched, and in that silence every person in the room understood something, understood it with the specific, irreversible comprehension that comes not from being told, but from watching 2 people in a room and seeing one of them unable to answer a question that an innocent man would have answered in the first second. I want legal counsel present, Thornwick said. It was the first thing he had said that was entirely honest. Valor looked at him, looked at Vane, looked at the 31 people in this room, advisors and lords and representatives who had built their careers inside an imperial structure that had been, in ways none of them had fully known, constructed around a buried lie, and who were now standing in the first light of a morning where that lie was on the table in documentary form. He thought about what it cost to stand here. Not to him. He was clear about what it cost him and had already paid it in the decision he'd made walking down the corridor. But to everyone in this room who had operated in good faith within a compromised system. The men and women who had given their competence and their loyalty to an empire whose foundations included this. He thought about Celine Ashcroft, standing beside him, who had given 14 months and every resource available to her to put the truth on this table, and whose father had given his life for it, and whose family name had been erased for it. He thought about his own father, who had been king when this happened, and the question he had set aside in the garrison room, had known or had not, and which he still did not have an answer to, and which was going to matter enormously when all of this was formally unraveled. He looked at the documents on the table. Truth was the only thing that couldn't be permanently altered. That was what she had said her father believed. Valor had governed for 11 years on the assumption that authority was what couldn't be permanently altered, that the strength of the throne was its own kind of permanence. He understood now, in this room, in the specific company of a man who had spent 11 years demonstrating the opposite, that authority without truth underneath it was architecture built on managed fiction, and that managed fiction was always, eventually, temporary. It had taken 14 months and a woman in gray livery who knew the sacred alpha tongue, but it had ended. Lord Vane, Valor said. His voice had the quality of a formal pronouncement, not raised, not performed, but carrying the specific gravity of a king who is no longer asking questions. You are suspended from your position as senior imperial counselor, effective immediately, pending formal investigation into your role in the alteration of official court records, the falsification of witness testimony in a capital proceeding, and the filing of a false security concern petition. He looked at Thornwick. Lord Thornwick, you are suspended from all Imperial Council positions, and your archive oversight role is revoked, pending investigation into the same charges, additionally including the unauthorized deployment of agents within the palace. The room absorbed this. Vane said, Your Radiance, this overreach will not— Davin, Valor said. Solt moved. He didn't touch Vane, didn't need to. He simply positioned himself with the contained, definitive presence of a man who works personal security and whose physical communication was always clearer than words, and Vane looked at him and stopped speaking. Thornwick looked at the guards at the chamber doors, looked at the room, looked at Valor, and Valor watched the last calculation run its course in Thornwick's face, the final audit of every remaining option, the assessment of whether any of them were viable, the specific moment when a man who has spent his career finding angles discovers that the room has finally run out of them. Thornwick sat down. He sat down in the nearest chair with the quality of a structure that has had its load-bearing element removed. Not dramatic, not violent, just a man who has been standing on a thing for a very long time and has stopped being able to stand on it. The room was quiet. Valor looked at the assembled advisors and lords and representatives. 31 people who were going to carry what had happened in this room back into every corridor of the Empire's governing infrastructure. He looked at their faces, the shock, the recalibration, the specific expression of people trying to determine what their relationship to this information was and what it meant for their positions and their loyalties. He looked at Seraphine Valhart. She was standing at the window where she'd been since he entered. Her expression had not cycled through shock or recalibration. She had watched the entire proceeding with the composed attention of a woman who is collecting information and has not yet distributed it anywhere. She met his eyes when he looked at her and held them without performance. He couldn't read her. He had never been able to read her completely, which was why he had never fully trusted her, and he noted this now as a piece of unfinished business in a morning that was already full of it. He looked back at the room. "The renewal assembly convenes in 3 weeks," he said. "Every piece of evidence related to the Ashcroft proceedings will be presented before the full assembly of lords. Every lord and advisor with any connection to the original redistribution will be required to provide testimony." He paused. "The truth of what happened to House Ashcroft will be entered into official imperial record. This is not a request. It is not subject to council vote. It is the decision of the Alpha King of the Iron Fang Empire." Nobody spoke. "Return to your offices," he said. "You will receive formal instruction from my chancellor by midday." The room began to move. Slowly at first, the hesitation of people who aren't certain what they're supposed to do with their bodies, when a situation has just fundamentally altered the ground under them, and then with the gradual resolution of people resuming function. Thornwick was escorted out by 2 of Salt's men. Vane walked out on his own, with the precise, contained carriage of a man preserving whatever dignity remained available to him. He did not look at Valor. He did not look at Celine. He did look at the door, at the documents on the table. One quick, involuntary look, the kind that happens before the discipline catches it. The look of a man saying goodbye to something he had built and maintained for a very long time. Then he was gone. The room emptied. Seraphine was last. She moved away from the window and toward the door, and as she passed the table, she stopped. She looked at the documents, looked at Celine, looked at Valor. "I had no part in the proceedings," she said, direct, without preface or performance. "I know," Valor said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not the political calculation he usually saw there, but something more unguarded, something that might have been, under different circumstances, closer to respect. Then she left. The chamber was empty except for Valor, Celine, and Solt. Valor stood at the head of the table and looked at the document spread across it, and felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has been running a sustained operation on adrenaline and the cold engine of necessary action, and has just reached the point where the action has paused and the body is submitting its invoice. His ribs ached from the vault. He had not registered it during the movement through the palace and the chamber, but it was there now. The impact from the exchange with Thornwick's man had caught him on the left side, and it had been filed under irrelevant during the hours since and was now reasserting its relevance. He breathed through it carefully. He looked at Celine. She was looking at the documents, at the testimony with the altered dates, at the private correspondence with 3 signatures, at the covenant verification that had been hidden in a vault for years, waiting for someone to find it and understand what it meant. Her face was very still. Not the controlled stillness of performance, the stillness of a person who is standing in the first quiet moment after a long, long effort and doesn't entirely know what their face is supposed to do with the absence of the thing they've been carrying. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked up. The question seemed to surprise her. Not its content, but its timing. The fact that it was being asked at all in a room full of implications and unfinished business, and an empire's worth of consequence spreading outward from the table between them. "I don't know yet," she said. He nodded. It was the most honest answer available, and he recognized it as such. He looked at the window. Outside, the city was fully awake now. The sounds of morning commerce and the movement of people who had slept through the night and were beginning their ordinary days with no awareness that the governing structure above them had just experienced a fundamental crack in its foundation. 3 weeks to the renewal assembly. 3 weeks to prepare a full formal case, the documentary evidence, the provincial recorder's testimony, the independent vault alteration verification from Kasich, the accumulated record of 14 months of Celine's work, and present it to every alpha lord and noble house in the empire in the one formal setting where what was said publicly became part of the permanent imperial record. Thornwick had allies in those territories. Even suspended, even under investigation, the network of relationships he had built over decades didn't dissolve overnight. Those allies would spend the next 3 weeks calculating their exposure and deciding whether to distance themselves from him or circle the wagons. Some of them would panic. Some of them would start removing records. Some of them would reach out to each other and begin building the counter-narrative that frightened men build when they understand that the story is being rewritten without them. And Vane would spend 3 weeks with his legal counsel constructing the defense that a man builds when he has spent decades in the legal and political architecture of an empire and knows every procedural tool available. He was not finished. He was damaged, and he was exposed, and his position was gone. But he was not finished, and Valor was under no illusion about the shape of the fight that remained. He picked up the private correspondence from the table, looked at the 3 signatures. He had spent 11 years trusting one of them, had built his governance, in part, on the framework that voice had helped construct. He thought about the decisions that framework had shaped, which problems had been brought to his attention and which had been quietly managed away, which alliances had been suggested and which had been allowed to dissolve, which lords had been recommended for positions of influence and which had been subtly characterized as unreliable. The scope of what he didn't know was still larger than the scope of what he did. That was the work of the next 3 weeks. Not just the Ashcroft case, the full audit. Every decision Vane had shaped, every recommendation Thornwick had made from his oversight positions. The complete structural review of an empire that had been partially governed by men with a shared interest in the king not looking at certain things. He was going to look at all of it. He set the correspondence down. "I need a chancellor briefing in 2 hours," he said to Solt, "and Kasich before that. I want the full verification document from the vault alteration timeline in formal legal format before the assembly." "Understood," Solt said. "And the Halvern province recorder," Velor said. "I want her brought to the capital. Safe escort. On my authority. She is not to travel without a protective detail." Solt nodded and moved toward the door. Velor looked at Celine. She was still standing at the table. Her hands were resting flat on the surface, on either side of the sealed testimony, and she was looking at it with the expression of a person who has just been in the same room as something they have been hunting for a very long time and is still determining whether the thing is real. "The assembly," she said. 3 weeks. "Yes." "They'll come after me between now and then," she said. Not a question. The assessment of a woman who has been operating in hostile territory for 14 months and understands how that territory works. Not Thornwick directly. He's too exposed, but allies. People with lateral relationships to the redistribution who have their own reasons to want this buried. "Yes," Velor said. "And the petition Vane filed is still technically active until it's formally dismissed. I'm dismissing it in the morning through the Chancellor's office." "That still leaves a window," she said. He looked at her. "I know." She looked back. "What are you going to do about the window?" He thought about the 14 months she had spent in his palace, building this case alone, with a 70-year-old archivist as her only ally, and the patience of a woman who had been taught by her father that endurance was a form of power. He thought about the note she had left him in the old tongue. He thought about her face in the vault, when the men came through the door. Not fear, exactly. Something harder. He thought about what it meant that she was still asking operational questions after 18 hours of continuous crisis, with the Empire's governing structure cracked open around her and her own safety still technically unresolved. Her father had raised someone who did not stop. "You're staying in the North Tower garrison room," he said. "Not as a prisoner, as a protected witness. My personal detail on the door. No movement without escort until the assembly convenes." She looked at him steadily. "That's 3 weeks." "Yes. I've been in this palace for 14 months on my own." "You've been in this palace for 14 months in a situation where the people who wanted to bury you believed you were buried," he said. "That's no longer the situation." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. He watched her work through the logic of it. The shift from the controlled invisibility that had protected her to the exposed visibility that now made invisibility impossible. and reached the conclusion that the logic was sound even though the constraint was real. "All right," she said. He nodded, started toward the door. "Valor," she said. He stopped. She had used his name, not his title, not the old-tongue formal construction, just his name, the way people say names when they mean the person rather than the position. He turned. She was looking at him with the expression he had first seen in the garden, the decision already made quality, the particular settled directness of a person who has resolved something internal and is communicating the resolution. "Thank you," she said. "For the garden. For coming down." He stood there with the morning light coming through the chamber windows and the documents on the table and the weight of 3 weeks between now and the renewal assembly and the empire pressing from every direction, and he thought about what she had said that night. "I've been waiting for someone in this palace to actually see me," and what it had cost her to say it and what it had started. "I should have seen you sooner," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at the documents. "You saw me when it mattered," she said. He left the chamber. He walked back through the palace with the morning moving around him and the empire waking into a day that would feel, to most of it, entirely ordinary. Councils and trade hearings and the routine business of a governing structure that had no awareness of what had shifted in its foundations in the small hours before dawn. In his chest pocket, against his ribs, the ache from the vault sharpened when he breathed. He noted it, filed it, moved through it. 3 weeks. The renewal assembly. Every alpha lord and noble house. The full formal record. The evidence that would make the Ashcroft restoration not a king's private decision, but a matter of public imperial record. Permanent, unalterable, built into the foundation of the empire the way the truth should always have been. He was in the main corridor, calculating the briefing sequence, when Solt appeared from the side passage at the same pace as before, not running, but close. Valor stopped. "What?" he said. Solt's face had the specific quality of a man delivering a second piece of news that is worse than the first. "The Assembly," Solt said. "Thornwick's border allies. 3 of them have filed a joint petition to the Imperial Council requesting the Assembly be moved forward." He paused. "To tomorrow." The corridor was very still. "They cannot move the Assembly without—" "They're not moving it," Solt said. "They're filing for an emergency compact session, under Article 14 of the founding agreement. It requires only 7 Lord signatures to convene and supersedes the scheduled Assembly calendar." Valor went very still. Article 14. The emergency provision built into the founding compact for situations of immediate threat to imperial stability. It had been used 3 times in the Empire's history, never in his reign. He knew it existed. He had never imagined it being used like this. "How many signatures do they have?" he said. 7 confirmed as of an hour ago, Solt said. "Possibly more by now." Valor stood in the corridor with this. Thornwick had moved faster than Valor had accounted for. Not through the legal defense structure, not through Vane's procedural machinery, through the one mechanism in the Imperial Founding Compact that allowed a group of lords to force a public reckoning before the king had time to fully prepare the case. They were going to force the confrontation, not in 3 weeks with the full weight of a formal assembly and a prepared documentary record and a provincial recorder brought safely to the capital. Tomorrow. In an emergency compact session where every lord would be present and the stakes would be framed not as an investigation into past wrongdoing, but as a crisis of imperial stability, and where the question put to the assembled lords would be shaped by the men who had called the session before Valor could shape it himself. He thought about the documents in the sealed cabinet, the testimony, the correspondence, the verification. Solid, real, documented. Enough to destroy the conspiracy in a formal proceeding with time to present it carefully. Not necessarily enough presented cold and without preparation in an emergency session convened by the opposition to a room of lords who would arrive already primed with Thornwick's framing. He thought about Celine Ashcroft in the North Tower garrison room. He thought about what he had just told her, that she would need to stand before the court in 3 weeks. He looked at Solt. "Get her," he said. Solt turned. And send for every lord currently in the capital, Valor said. Every single one. Not tomorrow morning, tonight. He looked at the corridor ahead, the length of palace between him and the throne room, between him and the machinery of a formal proceeding, between him and the moment that could no longer be managed from a distance. If they want an emergency compact session, they'll get one, but they don't get to set the room. Solt moved. Valor stood in the corridor for one moment, the last quiet moment before everything became irrevocable, and understood, with the full, clear-eyed certainty of a man who has stopped protecting himself from the implications of his own choices, that tomorrow would decide everything. Not 3 weeks, not with careful preparation, not with the provincial recorder safely seated and the documentary record formally presented. Tomorrow, in a room full of alpha lords and noble houses with the full weight of the empire watching, with Celine Ashcroft standing beside him in front of everyone who had ever been told her family was erased. He thought about what she had said in the garrison room when he asked if she was ready. "I've been ready for a long time." He walked toward the throne room. Behind him, somewhere in the north tower, a door was opening, and in the city below the palace walls, in the offices of 3 border lords who believed they had just forced the king into an impossible position, the emergency compact session notice was already being copied for distribution to every noble house in the capital. They believed they were calling the session. They did not yet know that Valor Dreadmore had just decided to call it himself, and they had no idea what he was bringing into the room with him. The throne room had not been opened at night in 11 years. Valor had opened it twice before. Once in his first month as king, when he had sat alone in it at 3 in the morning trying to understand what he had inherited, and once in year 4 when a border uprising had required an emergency convening that couldn't wait for daylight. Both times the room had felt like what it was, a space designed to produce a specific psychological effect in the people who entered it, and which produced, in the person sitting at its center, a specific and opposite kind of loneliness. He stood at its entrance now and looked down its length. The obsidian floor, the iron wolf sigil banners, the throne at the far end on its raised platform, with the ancient carved stone of the seat worn smooth by generations of men who had sat in it and learned one way or another what it actually meant. And he made the decision about the room, not the throne. He was not going to sit on the throne for this. He had the tables brought in from the council chamber, the long oak table, secondary seating arranged in a configuration that said this was a proceeding, not a performance. Documents laid out in the sequence that told the truth in the order the truth needed to be told. The original covenant verification at the center, the private correspondence, the sealed testimony, the land transfer record, and beside them, a formal summary prepared in the 2 hours between Solt's notification and the emergency notice going out. Kassik's vault alteration documentation, written in the precise legal language of an imperial investigation, with dates and signatures and the specific chain of evidence that transformed a collection of documents into a formal case. Lords arrived through the night. Some came quickly, with the energy of men who had been contacted by Thornwick's network and were arriving with a position already prepared. Some came slowly, with the careful movement of men who understood that the ground had shifted significantly and were not yet certain what they were walking onto. A few came with the specific quality of people who had suspected something for a long time and were arriving to see whether what they suspected was true. By the time the emergency session formally convened, 3 hours before dawn, the torches lit, the room carrying the pressed heat of 100 bodies in a space built for ceremony and now functioning as something closer to judgment. Every Alpha Lord currently in the capital was present. Valor stood at the head of the oak table. Celine Ashcroft stood at his left. She had changed from the gray servant's livery. Salt had arranged it. He hadn't asked how, and Valor suspected Corvon the archivist had been involved because the dress she wore was dark and simply cut and carried, in its quality and its construction, the unmistakable mark of garments that had been kept for a very long time by someone who understood what they were keeping them for. She stood straight, with her hands still at her sides and her chin at the angle he had learned to read as resolution rather than defiance. The difference being that defiance argues with the room and resolution has already finished that argument internally and moved past it. The border lords who had filed the emergency petition were seated across the table. 3 of them, hard men from the northern territories, with the specific weathered quality of lords who govern difficult land, and had learned that survival in difficult land requires alignment with whoever controls the resources. They had aligned themselves with Thornwick for a decade. They were here now with their position and Thornwick's framing and the procedural machinery of Article 14, and they were looking at Valor and at the woman beside him with the calculated attention of men preparing to use both. Lord Cassian Brennack, the eldest of the 3 and nominally their spokesman, spoke first. "Your Radiance," he said. The title carried the weight of form rather than deference. He was using it because the procedure required it, not because he felt it. "We appreciate the rapid convening. The petition was filed on the grounds of imperial stability. There is a matter of significant concern." "I know why you filed it," Valor said. Brennack paused. "You filed it," Valor said, "because you understand that the investigation currently underway threatens the network of financial and political relationships that your territories have built with Lord Thornwick over the past decade. You filed it because Article 14 gives you the ability to force a public proceeding before the case against Thornwick and Vane is formally prepared. And you filed it because you believe that a room full of lords, convened in emergency session, presented with Vane's foreign operative accusation against Celine Ashcroft, would create enough political pressure to slow or halt the investigation." He looked at Brennack steadily. "You are here because I let you be here. Because I want you in this room when the evidence is presented." Brennack's jaw was tight. The petition named a security concern. "The petition was filed by men connected to Lord Thornwick within 2 hours of his suspension," Valor said. "I will let the room draw its own conclusions about the independence of that concern." The room was very still. Valor looked at the assembled lords, 100 faces ranging across every expression available between shock and calculation. Men who had governed their territories in good faith, men who had known something was compromised and had chosen comfort over inquiry, men who had known nothing and were arriving at knowledge in real time with the specific disorientation of people who thought they understood the structure they lived inside. He looked at all of them. "The Ashcroft proceedings," he said, "were conducted in the 2nd year of my father's final reign. Lord Edrin Ashcroft was charged with treason and executed. His family line was struck from the noble registry. His holdings were redistributed." He paused. "This proceeding was a fabrication." The room produced a sound, not words, not a single response, but the ambient reaction of a large group of people receiving information that reorganizes their understanding of a foundational event. Valor put his hand on the covenant verification. "This is the original verification document from the Imperial Restricted Vault. It was hidden, deliberately, by someone who understood its significance, in the lunar vaults of this palace. It contains the founding compact attestation signatures that the altered vault record claimed no longer existed." He slid it forward. "The witness testimony used to convict Lord Ashcroft named border faction contacts who were, by dated imperial record, dead before the charges were filed. The timeline is impossible. The conviction was impossible. It was constructed." He put the private correspondence beside it. "This document names the men who constructed it, their communications, their financial arrangements, the specific steps taken to ensure the legal challenge could not survive." He looked at the room. Lord Malrek Thornwick, Lord Edric Vane, and an intermediary whose name is in the formal investigative record. He looked at Brennack. "If you have relationships with Thornwick, this is the moment to clarify their nature, because what this document describes is not a political mistake. It is the deliberate murder of an innocent man and the destruction of his family for financial gain, and I intend to treat it accordingly." Brennack looked at the document, looked at Valor, looked at the 2 lords beside him with the specific quality of a man who is rapidly reassessing whether the alliance he came into this room to defend is one he can afford to leave in. He said nothing. Celine spoke. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at Valor for confirmation. She simply spoke, in the clear, level voice of a woman who has been preparing these words since before she understood what preparation meant. "My father's name was Edrin Ashcroft," she said. "He was the head of a house that had served this empire for 2 centuries. He taught me the founding compact language because he believed the history of this empire belonged to everyone who lived inside it, not only to those who controlled access to it. She paused. He was killed by men who needed him gone. His wife, my mother, did not survive the winter after his execution. I was placed in state custody and then released into circumstances that the official record does not describe, because the official record was managed by the same men who created the charges. She looked at the assembled lords, not with anger, not with the performed emotion of someone making a case, but with the flat, exhausted, absolute truthfulness of someone stating facts they have lived with for so long that they have become as ordinary as breathing. I have spent the last 14 months in this palace, in the archives section, rebuilding the documentary record of what actually happened. I did it alone. I did it carefully. Everything I am telling you is verified, independently corroborated, and will survive any formal review you choose to conduct. She paused. My father believed that truth was the only thing that could not be permanently altered. I am here because he was right. The room was completely silent. Valor watched the silence work on the assembled lords, watched it move through the chamber the way certain things move, not with force but with weight, settling into the gaps between what people had believed and what they were now understanding, filling the space that managed information had occupied for 11 years. He watched Brennec's hands, flat on the table, pressing down by a fraction. The same fraction as Vane's hands on the council table. The specific physical response of a person whose position has just become untenable and who is calculating the cost of the options remaining. Brennac looked at the documents, looked at Celine, looked at Valor. If what is presented here is accurate, he said slowly, then the Northern Territory's relationship with Thornwyke was built on a foundation we were not aware of. It was not a confession, it was not an apology, it was the careful political language of a man creating distance from a sinking structure while preserving as much of his own position as the distance allowed. Valor had heard this kind of language for 11 years and knew exactly what it was and what it was not. But it was also in the specific context of an emergency session called by 3 border lords, a withdrawal. The petition had depended on Brennac's active support. Without it, the procedural machinery of Article 14 had no engine. The second lord, younger, with the specific expression of a man who has just understood that he bet wrong and is trying to limit the loss, said, "The petition was filed in good faith based on information we received from Lord Thornwyke's office. If that information was itself compromised, you can address the formal record of your involvement with my chancellor," Valor said. Not harshly, flatly, in the manner of a man sorting a pile into categories. That is a separate matter from what's on this table. The third lord said nothing. He looked at the documents and said nothing, and his silence was its own kind of language. Valor looked at the full room. He thought about the weight of what he was standing in the center of. Not the proceeding itself. The proceeding was moving. It was finding its shape. It was doing what the evidence required it to do. The weight he felt was something else. It was the accumulated cost of the last 24 hours, and the 11 years before them, and the specific understanding that power, when it is genuinely examined, is heavier than it appears from the outside. He had governed this empire for 11 years. He had believed, for most of those years, that governance was a matter of competence, gathering the right information, making the right decisions, maintaining the structures that kept the empire functioning. He had been a good king by most measurements available to him. He had rebuilt the treasury, suppressed the uprisings, managed the borders with more diplomatic precision than his predecessor. He had also, without knowing it, been a king who governed the version of his empire that certain men had agreed he should see. He had been competent within a frame that was itself compromised, and his competence within that frame had made the frame easier to maintain. The hardest thing was not what had been done to the Ashcroft family. The hardest thing was understanding that his authority had been used as the vehicle for it. Not his will, not his knowledge, but his name, his throne, the weight of the institution he represented. That Edrin Ashcroft had been killed by the machinery of an empire that Valor was, by that point, 3 years away from inheriting. He could not undo that. He had understood this in the garrison room, in the cold hours before dawn, but he understood it differently now. In a full room, in public, with the documents on the table and the assembled lords watching. The understanding had a different weight when it was witnessed, when it could not be privately resolved and quietly set aside. He didn't want to set it aside. That was the thing he had been arriving at through the last 24 hours, that he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. The recognition that the instinct to manage a problem, to resolve it efficiently and move forward, was precisely the instinct that had allowed this particular problem to survive for 11 years. Because managed problems stayed managed. They didn't get examined. They didn't get admitted. He looked at Celine. She was looking back at him with the expression of a person who has just said the most important thing they have ever said in public, and is now standing in the space after it, waiting to see what it does. He thought about her father, who had hidden documents in 3 locations, and taught a 6-year-old girl the founding compact language, and apparently told her, at some point that she had carried through everything that followed, that truth was the only thing that couldn't be permanently altered. Adrian Ashcroft had been right. It had taken 14 months and a woman who refused to disappear, and a vault that hadn't been properly altered, and a provincial recorder who kept records of things that felt wrong. It had taken all of that, and it had taken time. More time than it should have required, in an empire that was supposed to be governed by the rule of its own founding principles. But it had ended. Valor looked at the assembled lords. House Ashcroft, he said, in the formal register of an imperial pronouncement, is restored to its full noble standing, effective from this session. The treason conviction of Lord Adrian Ashcroft is vacated. The record of the Ashcroft proceedings is amended to reflect the documentary evidence presented tonight. The redistribution of Ashcroft holdings conducted following the proceedings is subject to formal review, and restitution will be determined by an independent commission reporting to this court. He paused. Lord Thornwyke and Lord Vane will face formal charges before the full assembly at the next scheduled convening. Any lord with documented connection to the original conspiracy is required to present themselves to the Chancellor's office for formal record review within 7 days. He looked at Branagh. Branagh held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. A small, careful motion. The nod of a man accepting a reality he did not choose but cannot refuse. The emergency session concluded. The lords filed out over the following hour, slowly, with the particular subdued quality of people who have witnessed something that requires time to finish being witnessed. There were conversations in small clusters near the chamber doors, the rapid political recalibration of men who had just had the map of their world redrawn. Some of them looked at Celine as they passed. Some did not. A few looked at her with something that was in the neighborhood of recognition. The expression of people who were only now seeing her in this room in this context, understanding who she had been the whole time. The chamber emptied. The documents remained on the table. Valor sat down in the nearest chair, not the throne, not the head position, just a chair at the side of the oak table, in the way that men sit when they have been operating at full capacity for an extended period and the capacity has reached its accounting. Celine sat across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The torchlight in the throne room had the particular quality of fire in large spaces. It moved without urgency, casting shapes that shifted slowly across the stone walls, and the room felt in its emptiness like a different place from the one that had held 100 people 20 minutes ago. Quieter. More honest. The commission, Celine said finally. For the holdings restitution. It will take time, he said. I know. She looked at the covenant verification on the table. Most of what was taken can't be returned. The properties have been developed, the trade rights have been restructured, the financial assets have been spent or reinvested over 11 years. The original lands can be restored, Opa, he said. The title and standing are already restored. What's built on the rest is a longer process. I know, she said again. He looked at her. Is it enough? She was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, processing it with the particular care of a person who has spent a long time with a goal and is now, for the first time, standing on the other side of it and discovering that the other side is different from how it appeared during the approach. I don't know yet, she said. I thought I would know. I thought the moment it was on the official record, I would know. She looked at the documents. My father is still dead. My mother is still dead. That doesn't change. No, he said. But his name is restored, she said. What he was, who he actually was, that's in the record now. The true record. She paused. He spent his whole life believing that the truth, if you preserved it carefully enough, would eventually surface. He was right. A pause. He just didn't live to see it. Valor looked at the table. I'm sorry, he said, for the years this took, for the empire that was used to do this, for my father's reign and my own, the years I spent governing without looking at what was underneath. She looked at him for a long time. You were 23, she said. That's not... You were 23, she said again, with the quiet firmness of a person making a distinction that matters. You inherited a court that had been structured around keeping certain things from the king. You governed with the information you were given. What Vane did, shaping your access to information from the inside, that's not a failure of your governance. It's a crime against it. She paused. There's a difference. He sat with that. He had been turning this question over since the garrison room. The question of how much of what had been done in his name was his responsibility to carry versus his responsibility to correct, and whether those two things were the same thing or different things, and what it meant for a king to govern well inside a compromised structure without knowing the structure was compromised. He didn't have a clean answer. He suspected there wasn't one. He suspected that what remained after the fire went out and the emergency session concluded and the lords went home to recalibrate their positions was the specific, unglamorous work of a man who has discovered the limits of his own authority and is choosing to respond to those limits not with the performance of having been above them all along, but with the patient, unspectacular labor of rebuilding on ground that is now, at least, honest. The Empire needs a full audit, he said, not just the Ashcroft matter. Everything Vane shaped access to, every recommendation Thornwyke made from his oversight positions, every decision that might have been framed to prevent a particular inquiry from forming. He looked at the table. It's going to take years. Yes, she said. I'm going to need people I can trust to do it, he said. People who understand what managed information looks like from the inside, who know the difference between a document that's accurate and one that's been arranged to appear accurate. She looked at him. That's a specific description. It is, he said. The torchlight moved. Outside the throne room's high windows, the city was beginning its morning. The ordinary, imperfect, ongoing life of people who lived inside the Empire without knowing the machinery above them, and who deserved, Valor thought, to have that machinery be what it claimed to be. I'm not going to return to the archive section, Celine said. No, he agreed. Whatever I do next... She stopped. Started again. Whatever comes next is different from 14 months of waiting. I know that. I just don't know yet what the shape of it is. He looked at her. You don't have to know tonight. She looked back. No, she said. I suppose I don't. The dawn came through the throne room windows slowly, the way dawn comes through high windows in old buildings, with patience, finding the stone first, then the floor, then the long table with the documents on it, then the two people sitting across from each other in a room that had been built for ceremony and was, at this specific moment, simply a room where two people were sitting after a very long night. Valor looked at the light on the covenant verification. He thought about the day Celine Ashcroft had arrived at the palace. 14 months ago. She had come in through the household employment office with a cataloging application and a name that the Empire had decided didn't belong to anyone anymore. And she had walked into the archives section and begun the slow, patient, meticulous work of rebuilding a truth that powerful men had spent years burying. She had done it alone. She had done it without allies except a 70-year-old archivist who had known her father and kept a secondary vault key in trust for a king he hoped would eventually need it. She had done it with nothing but what her father had given her, the language, the knowledge, the unshakable conviction that the thing that had happened to her family was wrong, and that wrong things, if you were patient and careful and didn't stop, could be corrected. She had been 22 years old. He thought about what it took to be that, to carry that, to walk into the palace of the empire that had destroyed your family and do the work of dismantling that destruction from the inside, without knowing whether anyone would ever see you, without any assurance that the king on the throne was the kind of man who would act on what you found. She had taken the risk anyway. She had corrected him at the banquet because she had decided the risk was worth it, and she had left him a note in the old tongue because she had trusted that the kind of man who responded to being corrected with genuine curiosity rather than fury was the kind of man who would act on the truth when it was in front of him. She had read him correctly. He thought about that, about what it meant for a person's character to be read correctly by someone who had every reason to be suspicious of it. There was a specific weight to being seen clearly, not as a title, not as a position, not as the political instrument of an empire, but as the particular person behind all of that. And having that clear-eyed reading produced trust rather than cynicism. It was, he thought, the most honest thing anyone had done for him in 11 years of rule. The light was fully in the room now. He picked up the covenant verification from the table, looked at it. The original signatures, the founding compact attestation, the document that had been hidden in stone for years to wait for a moment that its keeper believed would eventually come. He put it back down. "Celine," he said. She looked at him. "The empire is going to look different in a year," he said. "After the audit, after the Thornwick and Vane proceedings, after the commission works through the restitution process." He paused. "I'm going to need someone who understands what it's supposed to look like from the founding texts. Someone who has read the original compact. Someone who knows the difference between what was built and what was agreed to." She was quiet for a moment. "You're offering me a position," she said. "I'm telling you what the work is," he said. "What you do with that information is your decision." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. The specific expression of a person who has been through enough that what produces amusement in them is narrower and more precise than it used to be, and who recognizes this particular moment as something in that narrow range. "My father," she said, "would have argued that rebuilding the empire on its own original principles is the only form of restoration that lasts." "He was right," Valor said. She looked at the documents on the table, looked at the light on the stone floor, looked at him. "All right," she said. Months passed. The empire did not transform overnight. Empires don't. They change the way old buildings change, room by room, foundation examination by foundation examination, with the slow and sometimes painful discovery that certain walls are load-bearing and cannot be removed until something else is built to carry what they're carrying, and that the building of the replacement takes longer than anyone involved wants it to. Thornwick's formal proceedings occupied 6 weeks of the full assembly and produced the most extensively documented record of noble corruption in the empire's history. Former allies abandoned him early and completely, with the specific energy of men who have just understood that loyalty to a sinking structure is different from loyalty to a principle, and who are choosing, while they still can, which kind of loyalty they want to be associated with. He was stripped of rank, lands, titles, and the authority he had built over a decade, and he bore it with the particular quality of a man who had known, somewhere beneath the performance of confidence, that the structure he'd built was not permanent. Had known this the way everyone who builds on a lie knows it, in the part of themselves that keeps their own true accounting regardless of what the official record says. Vane's proceeding was quieter and more damaging. Quieter because Vane was, to the end, a man who managed his presentation even as the evidence dismantled it. More damaging because every piece of testimony, every document, every line of cross-examination illuminated not just the Ashcroft conspiracy, but the 11 years of information management that had surrounded it. The shape of what a capable man can do to a governing structure from the inside over time, with patience and access and the authority that comes from being trusted. The audit of those 11 years took longer than the proceedings. It was not clean. Some decisions Violor had made, shaped by Vane's framing, required correction. Some did not. Some were simply decisions that he had made in good faith on imperfect information, which was, he came to understand in the months of sitting with the audit's results, what governance actually was. Not perfect decisions from complete information. Decisions made by a fallible person with the information available to them, and the ongoing unglamorous willingness to look at those decisions again when better information arrived. He sat with the audit results for a long time. He sat with them the way you sit with something that shows you the limits of your own authority, not as a threat, but as a truth. The truth that the throne was not omniscient, that the king was not above the compromises and corruptions that the people inside the institution could introduce, and that the real work of governing well was not the performance of infallibility, but the structural commitment to honesty about fallibility. He wrote that into the new imperial charter, not as a philosophical statement, as a structural requirement, an independent oversight mechanism, seated outside both the royal household and the noble council, with the specific mandate of reviewing information access and document integrity on a continuous basis. Celine helped draft it. She spent 3 months on the language, working with the founding compact texts and the original covenant agreements and the specific provisions that the original Alpha Lords had included, because they had understood, in the forming of the empire, that power without accountability was not actually power, so it was borrowed time. The provincial recorder from Halvern arrived in the capital 6 weeks after the emergency session. She was 73, traveled with a single bag, and walked into the imperial archive with the expression of a woman who had been keeping a record for decades against the possibility of a day that she had not been entirely certain would arrive. She sat for 3 days with Corvan the archivist, who had been keeping his own record, and the two of them produced between them a corroborated documentary history of the Ashcroft proceedings that was, when it was completed, the most comprehensive refutation of managed imperial record in the empire's history. The provincial recorder went home after the testimony. She declined the formal imperial recognition Veilor offered and said, when asked why, that she had done what anyone with access to the truth and a working filing system was obligated to do, and that formal recognition for ordinary obligation was a category error. He liked her considerably. Corvan died in the autumn, peacefully, in his quarters, in the way that very old men die when they have done the thing they stayed alive to do and have decided it is sufficient. Veilor attended the private service. He stood at the back and did not make it a public occasion because Corvan had not been a public figure and had not wanted to be, and it seemed like the correct way to honor a man who had spent his career keeping track of what was true in the specific hope that it would eventually matter. It had mattered. The night the new imperial charter was formally ratified, in the full assembly, with every Alpha Lord present, in the same room where the emergency session had been convened months before, Veilor stood at the head of the table and watched the last signature go down and felt, for the first time in 11 years, something that he didn't immediately know the name of. He sat with it for a moment. It was not triumph. Triumph was a louder thing, a thing with a performance component, and this had no performance in it. It was quieter. It was the specific feeling of a man who has done a thing correctly and knows it, not because it was spectacular, but because it was honest, and the honesty of it was going to outlast the night. He thought this was probably what his job was supposed to feel like. The moonlit balcony outside the throne room had been built by the king 2 reigns before Veilor's father, who had added it for reasons that were lost to history, but had resulted in an elevated stone platform overlooking the capital's central plaza, with the city spread below it and the empire's lights reaching to the horizon in every direction. Veilor stood on it the night of the charter ratification, alone for the first moment in months, and looked at the city. He heard her before she appeared beside him, the specific quality of her footstep on the stone. Celine came to stand at the balcony's edge and looked at the city with him, and for a while neither of them said anything, because the city didn't require commentary and they had both said over the preceding months most of the important things already. The commission's preliminary report, she said finally. It came in this afternoon. I saw it. The primary holdings are recoverable, about 60%. The rest, she paused. The rest is built on, changed. It's different ground now. Yes, he said. My father would have said that's all right, she said. That you build where the ground is, not where the ground was. He looked at her. And you? She was quiet for a moment. The city moved below them. The ordinary, continuous movement of people living inside an empire that was, tonight, marginally more honest than it had been yesterday. I think he was right, she said. I think what I wanted wasn't the land. It was the name, the record. What actually happened in the actual record acknowledged. She paused. I have that. Yes, he said. The rest is... She stopped, looked at the horizon. The rest is living forward. He looked at her profile in the moonlight. She had the look of a person who has set something down after a very long time of carrying it and is discovering what their body feels like without the weight. Not lighter exactly, different, changed by the carrying, shaped by it, but no longer defined entirely by it. He had thought, in the early weeks after the emergency session, that he had no clear language for what she was to him. Not a subject. She had never been that, or had been it only technically. Not an ally, exactly, though she was that. Not a case he had chosen to act on, though the action had been real. The categories available to him from 11 years of throne-shaped thinking had not contained her cleanly, which was, he had come to understand, because she was not something that throne-shaped thinking had produced. She was someone he had seen, and who had, with the full weight of who she was, chosen to trust that seeing. The Charter has a provision, he said, for the appointment of an imperial counselor for foundational review, someone with specific authority to conduct periodic review of imperial decision-making against the original compact texts, independent of the royal household and the noble council. She looked at him. The Charter language describes it as a position requiring expertise in the founding compact, demonstrated institutional independence, and the capacity to speak truth to the throne without the throne's permission. He paused. Celine Ashcroft wrote most of that language. The corner of her mouth moved. She did. She was asked to consider the position. She's considering it, she said. He turned toward her, looked at her directly in the way he had looked at her in the garden, in the garrison room, across the council table. The full attention, without the management apparatus, without the distance. What I know about you, he said, I have not known about another person in 11 years of governing an empire. What I know is that you are more honest than any person I have been trusted to govern alongside, more patient than any advisor I have employed, and more accurate about the nature of the institution I run than I was before you corrected me in front of 400 people. He paused. I also know that you held a piece of stone in a vault, and you looked at 4 men like a person who had made a decision about how far you were willing to go. She looked at him steadily. What are you saying? I'm saying, he said, that the position of Imperial Counselor for Foundational Review is available to you, and that separately and not contingently I would like you to remain. She held his gaze for a long time. The city was very quiet below them. The empire stretched to the horizon in every direction, imperfect, ongoing, in the process of being made more honest by the painstaking, unglamorous, necessary work of people who were willing to look at what it actually was rather than what it had been presented as. I was going to stay anyway, she said. He looked at her. I had nowhere else to go, she said, and then I had somewhere to go, and I stayed anyway. That's a decision, not an absence of options. She paused. I'm staying. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked back at the city. She stood beside him. The moon was up fully now, and below them the capital moved in its ordinary patterns, and somewhere in the palace behind them the new charter was in the formal register, and the empire was, by exactly that much, different from what it had been the day before. It was not enough. It was never entirely enough. That was the nature of the work. There was always more ground to cover, more truth to locate, more managed fiction to dismantle. He understood this differently now than he had 11 years ago. 11 years ago, he had believed that a king who governed correctly would eventually arrive at a complete and stable condition. He understood now that governing correctly was not a destination. It was a practice, a daily decision to look at what was actually there rather than what it was easier to see. He had been learning this from a woman in gray livery for the better part of a year. Below the palace towers, the city's lights reached out into the dark in every direction, ordinary and ongoing and alive with the specific, irreducible complexity of people who deserved to live inside an institution that was trying, genuinely, to be what it claimed to be. He stood on the balcony with Celine Ashcroft beside him and the charter newly signed and the empire imperfect and ongoing around them, and he breathed the cold night air and felt, underneath the work and the weight and the years of it, something that was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter and more permanent. It felt like ground that was actually there. It felt like standing on something real,